In the gardens of Isfahan, where nightingales once sang to moon-drunk poets, the whispers of a great king still drift through jasmine-scented air. Here, where silk roads converged and empires were born from desert dreams, one man's vision transformed the soul of Persia. His name was Abbas, Abbas the Great, and his story unfolds like prayer rugs beneath starlight, woven with threads of ambition, wisdom, and the eternal dance between power and mortality. In palaces where shadows held secrets, and every dawn brought both promise and peril, a young prince learned that greatness is not inherited, but forged in the crucible of time. Listen now, as history reveals the man who made the desert bloom with cities of wonder, who turned a fractured realm into the jewel of the East, and whose legacy still echoes through the corridors of memory like the call of the muezzin at twilight. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. The winter of 1571 settled over the ancient city of Herat like a silk shroud, its cold breath carrying the scent of snow from distant mountains and the whispered prayers of merchants closing their shops against the gathering dusk. Within the walls of the royal palace, where Persian carpets muffled the footsteps of servants, and the light of oil lamps danced across intricate tilework, a child was born who would one day reshape the very foundations of an empire. Abbas was born into a world of splendour and shadow, where the Safavid dynasty ruled over vast stretches of Persia, but struggled against the constant threat of dissolution. His father, Crown Prince Muhammad Khordadbeh, possessed a gentle nature more suited to scholarly pursuits than the iron demands of kingship. The palace where Abbas drew his first breath was itself a testament to the complexities of Safavid rule, magnificent in its artistic achievements, yet vulnerable to the political storms that swept across the Iranian plateau like sandstorms from the desert. The infant prince entered a realm where Shia Islam had become the defining spiritual force, binding together diverse peoples under the banner of the 12 Imams. This religious transformation, initiated by the early Safavid rulers, had created a distinct Persian identity that stood apart from the Sunni Ottoman Empire to the west and the various Sunni Khanates to the east. Yet this religious unity masked deeper fractures, tribal loyalties that predated Islam itself, ethnic tensions between Persian, Turkmen and Kurdish populations, and the ever-present challenge of governing a land where mountains, deserts, and fertile valleys created natural barriers to centralized control. In the nursery where Abbas spent his earliest days, the sounds of the palace created a symphony of empire, the rustle of silk robes worn by courtiers, the distant echo of hoofbeats in courtyards where royal horses were exercised, the melodic recitation of Persian poetry that formed the cultural backbone of Safavid court life. His wet nurses, carefully chosen from noble families, would have whispered to him the ancient stories of Persian kings, tales of Cyrus the Great and the Achaemenid Empire, of Darius and his vast dominions, of the eternal struggle between light and darkness that formed the mythological foundation of Iranian consciousness. Even as a child, Abbas existed within a complex web of relationships that would shape his understanding of power and survival. His grandfather, Shah Abbas I, had ruled for over 50 years, establishing the Safavid dynasty as a major force in the Islamic world. Yet Tahmasp's reign had been marked by constant warfare with the Ottomans, internal rebellions, and the gradual weakening of central authority as powerful tribal confederations asserted their independence. The palace where Abbas learned to walk was filled with the tension of a dynasty that had achieved greatness, but struggled to maintain it. The architecture surrounding the young prince told its own story of Persian civilization. The palace complex in Herat, with its soaring arches and intricate muqarnas, represented centuries of artistic evolution. Gardens laid out in the traditional Chaharbagh pattern, fourfold gardens that symbolized paradise, provided spaces for contemplation and political discussion. Water channels carried the precious liquid that made civilization possible in this arid land, their gentle murmur a constant reminder of the delicate balance between abundance and scarcity that defined Persian statecraft. Abbas's earliest years unfolded during a period of relative stability, but the seeds of future conflict were already germinating. The Ottoman Empire under Sultan Selim II continued to press eastward, seeking to expand into Safavid territories. The Uzbek Khanates to the northeast posed a constant threat to Persian holdings in Central Asia. Within the empire itself, the Kizilbash tribes, the military aristocracy that had brought the Safavids to power, maintained their own armies and territories, creating a feudal system that limited the Shah's direct authority. The young prince's education began early, following the traditional pattern established for Persian royalty. Masters of Persian literature introduced him to the works of Ferdowsi, Hafez, and Rumi, poets whose verses had shaped the cultural consciousness of Iran for centuries. The Shahnameh, Ferdowsi's epic chronicle of Persian kings, became a particular focus of study, its stories of heroic rulers and their struggles against foreign invaders providing both entertainment and political instruction. These tales of ancient glory served as both inspiration and burden, reminding each generation of Safavid princes of the legacy they were expected to uphold. Religious instruction formed another crucial component of Abbas's early education. As a member of the Safavid royal family, he was raised in the Shia, tradition that had become the state religion under his ancestors. The complex theological concepts of Twelver Shi'ism, the belief in 12 divinely appointed imams, the concept of the hidden imam who would return as the Mahdi, the distinctive practices of temporary marriage and passionate mourning for the martyred Imam Hussein, all became part of his intellectual and spiritual formation. Yet this religious education was balanced by practical considerations, as the young prince learned to navigate the political implications of religious authority in a multi-ethnic empire. The palace where Abbas spent his childhood was a microcosm of the broader Safavid state, with its blend of Persian, Turkish and Arab influences. Courtiers spoke multiple languages, switching between Persian for poetry and formal occasions, Turkish for military matters, and Arabic for religious discussions. This linguistic diversity reflected the cosmopolitan nature of the Safavid court, where talented individuals from across the Islamic world came to seek patronage and advancement. The young prince absorbed this multilingual environment naturally, developing the communication skills that would later prove essential in his diplomatic dealings with European ambassadors and his military campaigns against diverse enemies. As Abbas grew from infancy into boyhood, the political landscape of his world began to shift dramatically. His grandfather, Shah Abbas I, who had provided stability for over 5 decades, was aging and increasingly concerned about the succession. The question of who would inherit the throne became a source of mounting tension within the royal family, as various princes and their supporters maneuvered for position. This period of uncertainty would prove formative for the young Abbas, teaching him early lessons about the precarious nature of power and the importance of building reliable alliances. The gardens of the palace in Herat became young Abbas's first classroom, where the intersection of nature and human artifice provided lessons in both beauty and strategy. Here, beneath the shade of ancient plane trees and beside channels that carried mountain water through carefully planned landscapes, the future Shah learned to read the subtle languages of power. His tutors, selected from among the most learned men of the empire, understood that education for a Safavid prince must encompass not merely books and recitation, but the complex arts of governance, diplomacy, and survival. Master Mirza Maki, the court's most respected scholar of Persian literature, would arrive each morning as the call to prayer echoed across the city's minarets. Under his guidance, Abbas memorized vast portions of the Shahnameh, learning to recite the epic verses that chronicled the deeds of ancient Persian kings. These were not merely literary exercises, but political education disguised as poetry. The stories of Jamshid's golden age, Rostam's heroic battles, and the tragic fall of the Sassanid Empire to Arab conquerors all carried implicit lessons about the nature of kingship, the importance of just rule, and the consequences of weakness or corruption. The young prince's calligraphy lessons took place in a chamber adorned with the finest examples of Persian artistic achievement. Here, surrounded by manuscripts whose illuminated pages glowed with gold and lapis lazuli, Abbas learned to shape the flowing letters of Persian script with the same precision that would later characterize his military campaigns. The master calligrapher, Ustad Dust Muhammad, taught him that each letter must be perfectly formed, each line properly spaced, for in Persian culture, beautiful writing was considered a reflection of spiritual refinement and intellectual discipline. Mathematics and astronomy formed another crucial component of Abbas's education, subjects that were essential for any ruler who hoped to govern effectively. The court mathematician, a learned man from Isfahan whose family had served the Safavids for generations, introduced the prince to the geometric principles that governed both the construction of palaces and the layout of military camps. Through the study of celestial movements, Abbas learned to understand the calendar systems that regulated agricultural cycles, religious festivals, and the timing of military campaigns. These lessons often took place on the palace roof, where the night sky provided a vast textbook of stars and planets. Military training began early, for no Safavid prince could hope to survive without mastering the arts of war. In the palace courtyards, where the sound of clashing swords mingled with the calls of peacocks in the royal gardens, Abbas learned to handle various weapons with skill and confidence. His archery instructor, a grizzled veteran of campaigns against the Ottomans, taught him that the bow was not merely a weapon, but a symbol of Persian martial tradition, stretching back to the Achaemenid Empire. The composite bow, with its layers of wood, horn and sinew, required not only physical strength, but also spiritual discipline and perfect timing. Horsemanship formed the foundation of military education, for the Safavid army relied heavily on mounted warfare. The royal stables housed hundreds of horses, from the swift Arabian breeds favoured for reconnaissance to the powerful Turkmen horses that could carry an armoured warrior through the chaos of battle. Abbas learned to ride almost before he could walk properly, developing the instinctive balance and control that would later make him a formidable military commander. His riding instructors, drawn from the Kizilbash tribes whose ancestors had conquered Iran for the Safavids, taught him not only the technical skills of mounted combat, but also the psychological aspects of leadership in battle. The palace library provided Abbas with access to works that expanded his understanding of the world beyond Persia's borders. Here, in a chamber where hundreds of manuscripts rested on cedar shelves, the young prince encountered the writings of Greek philosophers translated into Persian, Arabic treatises on medicine and mathematics, and chronicles of distant lands written by travellers and merchants. These texts opened his mind to possibilities beyond the traditional boundaries of Persian statecraft, introducing him to concepts of governance and military strategy that would later influence his revolutionary reforms. Religious education remained a constant presence in Abbas's daily routine, but it was far from the narrow theological training that might be expected. His religious tutors, learned mullahs who had studied in the great seminaries of Najaf and Qom, emphasized the practical applications of Islamic law to governance. They taught him that a just ruler must understand not only the letter of Islamic law, but also its spirit, adapting eternal principles to changing circumstances. This nuanced approach to religious authority would later enable Abbas to navigate the complex relationship between temporal and spiritual power that defined Safavid kingship. The young prince's exposure to the arts went beyond mere aesthetic appreciation to encompass the political dimensions of cultural patronage. In workshops attached to the palace, master craftsmen created carpets, metalwork and illuminated manuscripts that would serve as diplomatic gifts to foreign courts. Abbas learned to appreciate the subtle messages conveyed by artistic choices, the symbolic significance of certain colours, the political implications of iconographic programs, the ways in which artistic excellence could enhance a dynasty's prestige. These lessons in cultural diplomacy would prove invaluable when he later sought to position Safavid Iran as a major power worthy of the European respect and alliance. Language instruction formed another crucial element of Abbas's education, for the Safavid Empire encompassed diverse populations who spoke different tongues. Beyond his native Persian, the prince learned Turkish, the language of the Kizilbash military elite, and Arabic, the language of Islamic scholarship and commerce. His tutors also introduced him to the rudiments of other languages spoken within the empire: Kurdish, Armenian, and Georgian, enabling him to communicate directly with representatives of various ethnic communities. This linguistic versatility would later prove essential in his efforts to create a more unified and centralized state. The palace workshops where Abbas observed master craftsmen at work provided practical lessons in economic management and technological innovation. Here, skilled artisans produced the luxury goods that formed the backbone of Safavid international trade: silk textiles, carpets, metalwork, and precious stones. The young prince learned to appreciate the complex processes involved in creating these goods, from the cultivation of silkworms to the intricate techniques of carpet weaving. More importantly, he began to understand how control of these manufacturing processes could be used to strengthen royal authority and generate revenue for the state. Gardens played a special role in Abbas's education, serving as living textbooks that taught lessons about order, harmony, and the relationship between human will and natural forces. The palace gardens, laid out in the traditional Chahar Bagh pattern, demonstrated how water management, plant selection, and geometric design could create spaces that were both beautiful and functional. The prince learned to appreciate the symbolic dimensions of garden design, how the 4 rivers of paradise could be represented in earthly form, how the careful arrangement of trees and flowers could create microclimates that supported both aesthetic pleasure and practical agriculture. As Abbas approached adolescence, his education began to emphasize the practical aspects of administration and diplomacy. He attended meetings of the royal council, observing how his grandfather, Shah Abbas, managed the complex relationships between different tribal groups, religious authorities, and provincial governors. These sessions provided invaluable insights into the challenges of governing a diverse empire, teaching him to recognize the subtle signs of political tension and the importance of maintaining balance between competing interests. The year 1576 marked a turning point in the young prince's life, as the death of his grandfather Shah Abbas plunged the Safavid Empire into a succession crisis that would profoundly shape Abbas's understanding of political survival. The old Shah, who had ruled for 52 years, had become increasingly suspicious and paranoid in his final years, ordering the execution of several of his own sons and grandsons whom he perceived as potential threats to his authority. This atmosphere of fear and mistrust had created a court where loyalty was always suspect, and where the line between protector and enemy could shift with bewildering speed. The succession struggle that followed Tahmasp's death revealed the fundamental weaknesses of the Safavid system. The empire lacked a clear mechanism for transferring power, relying instead on a combination of hereditary claims, military support, and tribal alliances that could be manipulated by ambitious nobles. Abbas watched as his father Muhammad Kodabande, despite being the legitimate heir, struggled to assert his authority against powerful Qizilbash leaders who had their own agendas. The new Shah's gentle nature and poor eyesight made him appear weak to tribal chiefs, who respected only strength and decisiveness. The palace in Herat, which had been Abbas's childhood home, became increasingly dangerous as various factions maneuvered for position. Qizilbash emirs, who had served loyally under Tahmasp, began to question the new Shah's ability to lead, while provincial governors tested the limits of central authority by withholding tax revenues and refusing to provide military support. The young prince observed these developments with growing alarm, recognizing that his family's survival depended on their ability to navigate these treacherous political waters. The Ottoman Empire, ever alert to opportunities for expansion, began to increase pressure on Safavid borders. Ottoman forces launched raids into northwestern Iran, testing the new Shah's resolve and military capabilities. The traditional Safavid response, mobilizing the tribal armies under Qizilbash leadership, proved inadequate against the disciplined Ottoman janissaries and their superior artillery. These military defeats further undermined Muhammad Kodabande's authority, creating a vicious cycle where political weakness led to military failure, which in turn encouraged further political challenges. Abbas's education during this period took on a more urgent character, as his tutors recognized that the young prince might someday need to assume power under extremely challenging circumstances. His military training intensified, with greater emphasis on practical battlefield skills and the psychology of command. His instructors in statecraft began to focus on crisis management, teaching him to recognize the signs of political instability and to understand how strong leadership could restore order from chaos. These lessons were no longer theoretical exercises, but practical preparation for the challenges he might soon face. The tribal politics that dominated Safavid Iran became increasingly complex and dangerous. The Qizilbash confederations, the Rumlu, Ustajlu, Shamlu, Dulkadir, Afshar, Qajar, and Turkmen tribes, had originally been unified in their devotion to the Safavid cause, but generations of privileged status had bred jealousy and competition among them. Each tribe controlled specific territories and maintained its own military forces, creating a feudal system that limited the Shah's direct authority. The young Abbas learned to navigate these tribal relationships with increasing sophistication, understanding that his future success would depend on his ability to either balance these competing interests or find ways to transcend them altogether. The religious establishment, which had been a source of legitimacy for the Safavid dynasty, began to show signs of internal division. Some senior clerics supported the new Shah's attempts to maintain stability, while others questioned whether a ruler who could not defend the realm deserved their allegiance. The concept of the Shah as the representative of the hidden Imam on earth, a crucial element of Safavid legitimacy, required military success and effective governance to maintain credibility. Religious scholars debated whether persistent failure in these areas might justify supporting alternative claimants to the throne. Economic pressures added another dimension to the empire's growing crisis. The silk trade, which provided crucial revenue for the Safavid state, was disrupted by Ottoman control of traditional routes to European markets. Taxation became increasingly difficult to collect as provincial governors and tribal leaders diverted resources to their own use. The debasement of currency, a desperate measure to address fiscal shortfalls, led to inflation that hurt both urban artisans and rural farmers. These economic difficulties created social tensions that further undermined the dynasty's stability. The young prince's personal safety became a growing concern as the political situation deteriorated. Several of his cousins and uncles had been eliminated during the succession struggle, and the precedent of royal violence made everyone in the palace fearful of sudden changes in fortune. Abbas learned to sleep lightly, to trust few people completely, and to maintain escape routes from any situation that might turn dangerous. These harsh lessons in survival would later inform his approach to ruling, making him both more cautious and more decisive than his predecessors. News from the provinces painted an increasingly alarming picture of central authority's collapse. In the Caucasus, Georgian and Armenian nobles began to assert their independence, refusing to pay tribute or provide military service. The Persian Gulf ports, crucial for trade with India and the Far East, fell under the control of the local strongmen who governed more like independent rulers than provincial governors. The ancient cities of Khorasan, including Herat itself, faced increasing pressure from Uzbek raiders who crossed the Amu Darya with impunity. The court atmosphere in which Abbas spent his teenage years was characterized by constant intrigue and shifting alliances. Noble families who had served the Safavids for generations began to hedge their bets, secretly communicating with potential alternative rulers while publicly maintaining their loyalty to Muhammad Khordabandeh. Spies and informants proliferated, creating an environment where even casual conversations could be interpreted as treasonous, and where paranoia became a survival skill. Despite these challenges, Abbas's education continued under the guidance of tutors who recognized his exceptional potential. They observed his quick intelligence, his ability to read people and situations accurately, and his natural charisma that drew others to him. More importantly, they noted his capacity to learn from the mistakes of others, to understand the systemic problems that were destroying the empire, and to envision solutions that went beyond the traditional approaches that had failed his father. The palace libraries became a refuge for the young prince, where he could study the histories of other dynasties and civilizations that had faced similar challenges. He read accounts of the Ottoman Empire's rise to power, seeking to understand how that rival state had achieved such remarkable success. Chinese dynastic histories, translated into Persian, provided examples of how effective centralization could overcome feudal fragmentation. Greek and Roman texts available in Arabic translation offered insights into the relationship between military innovation and political survival. As Abbas approached his 17th birthday, the crisis deepened when a coalition of powerful Qizilbash emirs began to openly discuss the possibility of deposing Muhammad Khordabandeh in favor of a more capable ruler. The young prince found himself at the center of these discussions, as many nobles believed that his youth and energy might provide the leadership the empire desperately needed. However, Abbas understood that accepting such support would mean inheriting not only the throne, but also the seemingly impossible task of restoring order to a realm that appeared to be disintegrating. The military situation continued to deteriorate as Ottoman forces achieved a series of victories that highlighted the inadequacy of traditional Safavid tactics. The fall of Tabriz, the empire's second city to Ottoman forces in 1585, represented a particularly devastating blow to Safavid prestige and demonstrated the urgent need for fundamental military reform. The young prince recognized that any future Shah would need to revolutionize the empire's military system if it were to survive in an increasingly competitive international environment. The autumn of 1587 descended upon the Safavid Empire like a gathering storm, bringing with it the winds of change that would sweep the young Abbas toward his destiny. The palace in Herat, which had sheltered his childhood dreams, now echoed with the urgent whispers of conspirators who had concluded that only dramatic action could save the dynasty from complete collapse. The 16-year-old prince found himself at the center of a web of intrigue that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of Persian civilization itself. The catalyst for the impending transformation came from an unexpected source. Murshid Quli Khan, the leader of the Ustajlu tribe and one of the most powerful nobles in the empire. This grizzled veteran of countless campaigns had initially supported Muhammad Khodabander's accession, hoping that the new Shah would prove more decisive than his gentle nature suggested. However, as military defeats mounted and provincial rebellions spread, Murshid Quli Khan began to question whether the dynasty could survive under such weak leadership. The Ottoman capture of Tabriz had convinced him that radical change was necessary, and he began to look toward the young prince as a potential solution to the empire's mounting crisis. The conspiracy that would change the course of Persian history began in the gardens of the palace, where the sound of flowing water masked the whispered conversations of men who dared to contemplate regicide. Abbas listened as these powerful nobles outlined their grievances against his father, their concerns about the empire's future, and their belief that only a strong young ruler could restore Safavid power. The prince recognized that these men were not motivated by personal loyalty to him, but by desperation and the calculation that his youth might make him more malleable to their influence. The planning of the coup required careful coordination, as the conspirators needed to ensure that their actions would be accepted by the broader nobility and the religious establishment. They understood that merely deposing Muhammad Khodabander would not solve the empire's problems unless they could also address the underlying issues of tribal fragmentation, military weakness, and administrative inefficiency. Abbas observed these preparations with growing understanding of the complex factors that would determine his success or failure as a ruler. The religious justification for the coup posed particular challenges, as Islamic law generally required obedience to legitimate authority. However, the conspirators found support among some senior clerics, who argued that a ruler who could not defend the realm was failing in his fundamental duty to protect the faith. The concept of maslaha, the public interest, was invoked to justify actions that might otherwise be considered treasonous. These theological debates provided Abbas with valuable insights into the relationship between religious authority and political power that would later inform his approach to governance. The military preparations for the coup required the utmost secrecy, as any premature revelation could result in the conspirators' execution. Units of the royal guard were carefully infiltrated, key commanders were approached with bribes or threats, and arrangements were made to secure the palace complex and the royal treasury. Abbas learned to appreciate the crucial importance of controlling information and maintaining operational security, skills that would prove invaluable throughout his later reign. The psychological preparation for what he was about to do weighed heavily on the young prince's mind. Despite his father's failures as a ruler, Abbas felt the natural bonds of filial affection and respect that made the prospect of deposing him deeply troubling. However, he also recognized that his personal feelings were less important than the survival of the dynasty and the welfare of the empire's millions of subjects. This internal struggle between personal loyalty and political necessity would remain a constant theme throughout his life. The final weeks before the coup were marked by increasing tension as rumours began to circulate about possible challenges to Muhammad Khodabandi's authority. The Shah himself seemed to sense the growing danger, increasing his personal security and expressing suspicion about the loyalty of various nobles. However, his gentle nature and limited political skills prevented him from taking the decisive action that might have prevented the conspiracy from succeeding. Abbas watched these developments with mixed feelings of sympathy and frustration, understanding that his father's very virtues made him unsuitable for the harsh realities of 16th century kingship. The coup itself took place on a cold morning in October 1587, when the conspirators moved swiftly to secure the palace complex and isolate Muhammad Khodabandeh from his remaining supporters. The operation was executed with remarkable efficiency, suggesting careful planning and broad support among the military elite. Abbas found himself suddenly proclaimed as Shah of Iran at the age of 16, inheriting a crown that carried with it the weight of centuries of Persian tradition and the daunting challenge of restoring a crumbling empire. The immediate aftermath of the coup revealed the complexity of the situation Abbas had inherited. While the major conspirators celebrated their success, other nobles remained suspicious about the new Shah's intentions and capabilities. The deposed Muhammad Khodabandeh was treated with respect and given a comfortable retirement, but his fate served as a constant reminder of the precarious nature of royal authority. The young Shah understood that his initial supporters expected to be rewarded for their loyalty, but he also recognized that their expectations might conflict with his own vision for the empire's future. The new Shah's first act demonstrated the political acumen that would characterize his entire reign. Rather than immediately implementing radical changes, he moved carefully to consolidate his position and assess the full extent of the challenges facing the empire. He confirmed many existing officials in their positions, announced his intention to respect traditional privileges and customs, and sought to reassure various constituencies that the change in leadership would not result in arbitrary persecution or wholesale disruption of existing arrangements. The international reaction to Abbas's accession was mixed, reflecting the complex diplomatic situation of the late 16th century. The Ottoman Empire, preoccupied with its own internal challenges and wars in Europe, initially adopted a wait-and-see approach, curious to determine whether the new Shah would prove more or less capable than his predecessor. European powers, seeking allies against Ottoman expansion, began to express interest in establishing diplomatic relations with the young ruler. The Uzbek Khanates, sensing opportunity in the recent turmoil, increased their pressure on Safavid borders, testing the new Shah's resolve and military capabilities. The challenges facing the 16-year-old Shah were enormous and seemingly insurmountable. The empire's military forces were demoralized and inadequately equipped, its financial resources severely depleted, and its administrative system corrupted by decades of neglect. Provincial governors exercised near-independent authority, tribal leaders pursued their own agendas, and foreign enemies pressed on multiple fronts. The religious establishment, while generally supportive of the dynasty, harboured diverse opinions about the proper relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. Despite these daunting challenges, Abbas possessed certain advantages that would prove crucial in the years ahead. His youth made him less threatening to established power centres, allowing him to build coalitions that might have been impossible for an older, more experienced ruler. His excellent education had provided him with a broad understanding of Persian history, Islamic law, military strategy, and diplomatic practice. Most importantly, his direct experience of the empire's crisis had given him insights into the systemic problems that needed to be addressed if the dynasty were to survive and prosper. The young Shah's first winter on the throne was spent in careful observation and planning, as he sought to understand the full complexity of the situation he had inherited. He met with tribal leaders, religious scholars, military commanders, and administrative officials, listening to their concerns and beginning to formulate his own vision for the empire's future. These consultations reveal the depth of the problems facing the realm, but they also suggested possible solutions that had not been attempted by previous rulers. As the season turned towards spring, Abbas began to implement the first phase of what would become a comprehensive program of reform and revitalization. The empire that had seemed on the verge of collapse in 1587 would be transformed over the following decades into one of the most powerful and prosperous states in the world. The young man who'd been thrust onto the throne by desperate nobles would prove to be one of the greatest rulers in Persian history, earning the title by which he would be remembered, Abbas the Great. The path that lay ahead would be marked by military campaigns, administrative reforms, diplomatic initiatives, and cultural achievements that would restore the Safavid Empire to its former glory and establish it as a major power in the Islamic world. The lessons learned during his youth about the importance of strong leadership, the dangers of political fragmentation, and the need for constant adaptation to changing circumstances would guide him throughout his long and transformative reign. As he prepared to begin this monumental task, Abbas understood that his success would be measured not only by his ability to restore the empire's military and political strength, but also by his capacity to create lasting institutions that could ensure its continued prosperity long after his death. The young Shah's fingers traced the edges of the ancient maps spread across the polished marble table, their delicate Persian script marking territories that existed more in memory than in present reality. Outside the windows of the palace in Qazvin, the mountain winds carried whispers of rebellion, of tribal lords who questioned whether this 16-year-old boy possessed the strength to hold together an empire that seemed to fracture with each passing season. Abbas understood, with a clarity that surprised even his closest advisors, that the throne he had inherited was not merely a seat of power, but a precipice overlooking chaos. The Safavid dynasty, established by his ancestor Shah Ismail nearly a century before, had grown bloated with corruption and weakened by the constant struggles between the Kizilbash tribal confederations who had originally brought the Safavids to power. These red-turbaned warriors, whose loyalty had once been absolute, now viewed the throne as their rightful prize, treating successive Shahs as little more than puppet rulers to be manipulated for their own gain. The palace corridors echoed with the measured footsteps of men who spoke in hushed tones, their conversations laced with the careful calculations of those who lived perpetually between loyalty and ambition. Abbas moved through these halls like a ghost, observing everything while revealing nothing. He had learned early that survival in the Safavid court required the ability to read men's souls through their expressions, to understand the difference between a bow of respect and a genuflection of mockery. His grandmother, the formidable Gawashad Khanum, watched him with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of 3 previous Shahs. In her chambers, decorated with intricate tilework that caught the afternoon light like fragments of sapphire and gold, she spoke to him of the delicate art of ruling an empire built on shifting sands. Power, she would tell him, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent navigating the treacherous waters of court politics, is not taken by force alone. It must be earned through understanding, maintained through wisdom, and preserved through strength that others fear to test. The empire Abbas inherited stretched from the Caucasus Mountains in the north to the shores of the Persian Gulf in the south, from the Ottoman frontier in the west to the lands beyond the Oxus River in the east. Yet this vast territory existed more as a collection of semi-autonomous regions than as a unified state. The Kizilbash tribes controlled their territories with the independence of feudal lords, paying tribute to the Shah when it suited their interests and ignoring his commands when it did not. The governor of each province operated according to his own interpretation of royal authority, creating a patchwork of competing interests that threatened to tear the empire apart. Abbas spent his early months as Shah in careful observation, studying the patterns of loyalty and rebellion that had defined his predecessors' reigns. He learned that the Ustajlu tribe dominated the northern provinces, their warriors known for their fierce independence and their reluctance to submit to central authority. The Shamlu held sway over the eastern territories, their loyalty purchased through generous grants of land and the promise of military glory. The Rumlu controlled strategic positions along the western frontiers, their allegiance shifting like desert sands depending on the perceived strength of the throne. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace lay shrouded in the deep blue darkness that precedes the sun's arrival, Abbas would walk the gardens his ancestors had planted, their fountains singing soft melodies that seemed to carry the whispers of those who had ruled before him. The roses that bloomed in these gardens had been tended by gardeners whose fathers had served previous Shahs, their roots drinking from the same waters that had nourished the dreams of empire builders and the sorrows of those who had failed to hold their kingdoms together. It was during one of these solitary walks that Abbas encountered the man who would become his most trusted advisor, Mirza Salman Jaberi, a bureaucrat whose family had served the Safavid administration for generations. Unlike the tribal chiefs who surrounded the throne with their barely concealed ambitions, Mirza Salman possessed a deep understanding of the administrative mechanisms that kept an empire functioning. He spoke to Abbas not of glory or conquest, but of the practical necessities of governance, the collection of taxes, the maintenance of roads, the regulation of trade, and the delicate balance between provincial autonomy and central authority. The transformation of the Safavid military began not with grand proclamations or dramatic reforms, but with quiet conversations held in the privacy of the royal chambers. Abbas understood that to challenge the Kizilbash directly would invite the very rebellion he sought to prevent. Instead, he began to construct an alternative power structure, one that would gradually reduce the empire's dependence on tribal loyalty while building a more reliable foundation for royal authority. The inspiration for this transformation came from an unexpected source, the Ottoman Empire, Persia's greatest rival. Abbas had studied reports from his spies in Constantinople, learning how the Ottoman sultans had created the Janissary Corps, an elite military force drawn from Devshirme recruits who owed their loyalty directly to the throne rather than to tribal affiliations. While the Ottomans used Christian boys converted to Islam for this purpose, Abbas recognized that the principle could be adapted to Persian circumstances. He began by establishing a new military unit called the Ghulams, composed of Georgian, Armenian, and Circassian captives who had been converted to Islam and raised within the royal household. These men, torn from their birth families and cultures, formed bonds of loyalty that transcended tribal allegiances. They were trained not merely as soldiers, but as administrators, their education encompassing the arts of war, the subtleties of diplomacy, and the complexities of imperial governance. The Ghulam system represented a revolutionary departure from traditional Persian military organization. Unlike the Qizilbash, who served the Shah as part of their tribal obligations and could withdraw their support if their interests conflicted with royal policy, the Ghulams belonged entirely to the crown. They possessed no independent power base, no tribal territories to retreat to, no alternative source of identity beyond their service to the Shah. Their advancement depended entirely on royal favour, creating a class of administrators and military officers whose interests aligned completely with the strengthening of central authority. Abbas expanded this system gradually, careful not to alarm the tribal chiefs who still provided the bulk of the empire's military strength. He presented the Ghulams as a supplementary force, additional troops to strengthen the realm's defences rather than replacements for the traditional tribal levies. The Qizilbash, secure in their belief that they remained indispensable to the empire's security, initially welcomed these additions to the royal army, failing to recognise that Abbas was methodically constructing the instrument of their own marginalisation. The establishment of the Ghulam Corps required not merely military innovation, but economic transformation. The traditional system of land grants, tiul, that supported the Qizilbash tribes had to be supplemented by new sources of revenue that could fund a professional military force. Abbas turned his attention to the empire's commercial potential, recognizing that trade rather than tribute offered the most reliable foundation for royal finances. Persia occupied a unique position in the world's commercial geography, serving as the bridge between Europe and Asia along the ancient Silk Road. The empire's territories encompass some of the world's most valuable trade routes, their caravansaries and bazaars serving as meeting points for merchants from Venice and Amsterdam, from India and China. However, the political fragmentation that had characterized recent decades had disrupted these commercial networks, with local governors imposing arbitrary taxes and tribal raids, making travel dangerous and unpredictable. Abbas began the careful work of commercial restoration, establishing new regulations that standardized weights and measures throughout the empire, creating a unified currency system that facilitated trade across provincial boundaries and guaranteeing the safety of merchant caravans through the deployment of his new military units. These reforms not only increased the empire's revenue, but also created new constituencies of support among the merchant classes who had prospered under the previous disorder but now recognized the advantages of imperial stability. The first serious test of Abbas's reforms came not from within the empire, but from beyond its borders. The Ottoman Empire under Sultan Murad III had been expanding its influence in the Caucasus region, supporting local rebellions against Safavid authority and gradually annexing territories that had traditionally acknowledged Persian suzerainty. The ancient city of Tabriz, which had served as the first capital of the Safavid dynasty, now lay under Ottoman occupation, its mosques and madrasas serving as reminders of the empire's diminished power. The pressure for military action came from multiple directions. The Qizilbash tribes, eager for the glory and plunder that successful warfare provided, urged the young Shah to launch an immediate campaign to reclaim the lost territories. The religious establishment, led by the powerful clerics who had long supported the Safavid claim to divine authority, declared the recovery of Tabriz to be a religious obligation that could not be delayed without compromising the dynasty's legitimacy. Abbas, however, understood that premature action would likely result in disaster. His military reforms were still incomplete, his treasury remained insufficient to support a prolonged campaign, and his hold on power was not yet secure enough to survive a major military defeat. Instead of rushing into war, he chose to strengthen his position through a series of strategic withdrawals and diplomatic maneuvers that bought time for his reforms to take effect. This decision required enormous personal courage, as it exposed Abbas to accusations of cowardice and weakness from those who measured royal authority by the speed with which it responded to foreign provocations. The young Shah endured months of criticism from tribal leaders who questioned his fitness to rule, from courtiers who whispered about his reluctance to defend the empire's honour, and from religious authorities who suggested that his failures to act decisively indicated a lack of divine favour. During this period of intense pressure, Abbas found solace in the company of scholars and artists who had gathered at his court. These men, refugees from the various conflicts that had disrupted the empire's cultural centres, brought with them the accumulated wisdom of centuries of Persian civilization. They reminded Abbas that the greatest Shahs of the past had been not merely conquerors, but builders, rulers who had created institutions and traditions that outlasted their own lifetimes. The poet Fariduddin Attar's words, copied in elegant Nastaliq script on the walls of the royal library, spoke to Abbas of the patience required for true achievement. The Sufi's path is not measured in the speed of his steps, but in the depth of his understanding. Abbas found in these mystical teachings a framework for understanding his own situation, recognizing that the apparent weakness of strategic retreat could become the foundation for future strength. Meanwhile, the Ghulam system began to demonstrate its effectiveness in ways that even Abbas had not anticipated. The converted Georgian and Armenian officers, trained in both traditional Persian military arts and the latest Ottoman techniques, proved remarkably adaptable to the changing demands of warfare. They served not merely as soldiers but as intelligence agents, their knowledge of multiple languages and cultures allowing them to gather information about enemy movements and intentions that would have been impossible for traditional Persian commanders to obtain. One of these officers, a Georgian convert named Allaverdi Khan, emerged as a military genius whose strategic insights would prove crucial to Abbas's later successes. Allaverdi had been captured as a young boy during one of the border conflicts that perpetually disrupted the Caucasus region, but rather than harbouring resentment against his captors, he had embraced his new identity with remarkable enthusiasm. He understood warfare not as a matter of tribal honour or religious obligation, but as a technical discipline requiring careful planning, precise execution, and constant adaptation to changing circumstances. Under Allaverdi's guidance, the Ghulam Corps developed new tactical formations that combined traditional Persian cavalry charges with disciplined infantry maneuvers borrowed from Ottoman military manuals. They practiced with firearms imported from European merchants, learning to coordinate musket volleys with cavalry attacks in ways that multiplied the effectiveness of both. Most importantly, they developed a system of military engineering that allowed them to conduct effective siege operations, a capability that had been largely absent from Persian armies for several generations. While Abbas waited for the opportune moment to test his military reforms in battle, he began implementing a series of administrative changes that would fundamentally alter the nature of the Safavid state. These reforms, implemented gradually and often disguised as temporary measures necessitated by current circumstances, represented a quiet revolution in the distribution of power within the empire. The traditional system of provincial governance had relied on the appointment of Qizilbash governors who ruled their territories with considerable autonomy, collecting taxes according to their own judgment, and maintaining military forces that served the central government only when their tribal interests aligned with royal policy. Abbas began to replace this system with a more centralized structure in which governors, increasingly drawn from the Ghulam class, served at the pleasure of the Shah and could be removed or transferred at will. This transformation required enormous diplomatic skill, as Abbas had to convince the tribal leaders that these changes served their interests rather than threatening them. He presented the appointment of Ghulam governors as a means of reducing the administrative burden on tribal chiefs, allowing them to focus on their traditional roles as military leaders while professional administrators handled the mundane details of provincial governance. He offered compensation in the form of honorary titles, increased military commands, and generous pensions that maintained the social status of tribal leaders while gradually reducing their political power. The success of these reforms depended on Abbas's ability to demonstrate that the new system produced superior results to the old. The provinces under Ghulam administration showed marked improvements in tax collection, road maintenance, and commercial activity. Merchant caravans reported fewer incidents of robbery and extortion, while local populations found that disputes could be resolved more quickly and fairly under the new administrative system. These practical improvements helped to legitimize the broader transformation of the empire's governance structure. Abbas understood that lasting reform required not merely the replacement of old institutions with new ones, but the creation of new constituencies of support that would defend the reformed system against attempts at restoration. The merchant classes, the urban artisans, and the professional administrators who benefited from the new order became natural allies of the crown, their prosperity dependent on the continuation of the reforms rather than their reversal. At the same time, Abbas worked to maintain the loyalty of the traditional elites by involving them in the implementation of his reforms. He established new council structures that gave tribal leaders formal roles in the discussion of imperial policy, creating the appearance of consultation while ensuring that final authority remained with the throne. He commissioned new works of art and literature that celebrated the contributions of the Qizilbash to Persian history, honouring their past achievements while subtly indicating that their future role would be different from their historical position. The religious establishment presented a particular challenge, as the clerics who had long supported the Safavid dynasty possessed both the authority to legitimize or delegitimize royal policy and the organizational structure to mobilize popular opposition if they chose to do so. Abbas approached this challenge with characteristic subtlety, presenting his reforms as necessary steps in the defense of Shia Islam against Sunni Ottoman expansion, rather than as fundamental changes to the empire's governance structure. He commissioned new religious works that emphasized the importance of strong central authority in defending the true faith, and he established new religious institutions that provided employment and influence for clerics who supported his policies. At the same time, he quietly marginalized religious leaders who opposed his reforms, using his control over religious appointments and endowments to reward cooperation and discourage dissent. The transformation of the imperial court itself reflected these broader changes in the empire's power structure. The traditional ceremonies that had celebrated the relationship between the Shah and the tribal chiefs were gradually replaced by new rituals that emphasized the absolute authority of the crown. The physical layout of the palace was redesigned to create new spaces for audiences with foreign ambassadors and commercial delegations, while the traditional assembly halls where tribal leaders had gathered to discuss policy were allowed to fall into disuse. These changes, subtle individually but revolutionary in their cumulative effect, created a new model of Persian kingship that would influence the development of the empire for generations to come. Abbas was transforming himself from a tribal chief who ruled with the consent of his fellow warriors into an absolute monarch who derived his authority from divine appointment and maintained his power through professional military and administrative institutions. By the winter of 1598, nearly a decade into his reign, Abbas had succeeded in creating the foundations for a fundamentally different kind of empire. The Julam system had evolved into a sophisticated military and administrative machine that provided the throne with unprecedented independence from tribal politics. The commercial reforms had restored the empire's prosperity, while creating new sources of revenue that could fund professional institutions. The diplomatic initiatives had established relationships with European powers that offered both military support and economic opportunities. Yet the ultimate test of these reforms remained ahead. The Ottoman Empire under the new Sultan Mehmed III had renewed its pressure on the Persian frontier, launching a series of raids that threatened to destabilize the entire northwestern region of the empire. The fortress city of Ganja, which controlled the strategic routes through the Caucasus, had fallen to Ottoman forces, while the ancient city of Erevan found itself under siege by armies that seemed to grow stronger with each passing season. The moment for decisive action had arrived, but Abbas understood that the coming conflict would determine not merely the territorial extent of his empire, but the survival of the entire reform program he had spent years developing. A military defeat would not only result in the loss of valuable territories, but would also discredit the new institutions he had created, potentially leading to a conservative restoration that would return the empire to its previous state of weakness and fragmentation. The preparations for war revealed the extent to which Abbas had succeeded in transforming the empire's military capabilities. The Ghulam Corps, now numbering in the tens of thousands, had evolved into a professional army that could be deployed independently of tribal support. These troops were equipped with modern firearms imported from European manufacturers, trained in the latest siege techniques, and organized according to military principles that emphasized discipline and coordination over individual heroism. Alaverdi Khan, now serving as the supreme commander of the Ghulam forces, had developed a comprehensive strategy that would test the new military system against the Ottoman armies that had previously proven themselves superior to traditional Persian forces. The plan called for a coordinated campaign that would simultaneously defend the empire's existing territories while launching counterattacks designed to recover the lands lost during the previous decade of weakness. The logistical requirements of this campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of Abbas's administrative reforms. The centralized tax system provided the resources necessary to maintain a professional army in the field for extended periods, while the improved road network allowed for the rapid movement of troops and supplies across vast distances. The merchant classes, now dependent on imperial stability for their prosperity, provided both financial support and intelligence about Ottoman movements and intentions. As the army prepared to march, Abbas faced the delicate task of maintaining the loyalty of the Kizilbash tribes, while ensuring that military command remained in the hands of his professional officers. He accomplished this by creating a dual command structure in which traditional tribal leaders retained their honorary positions, while operational control rested with the Ghulam commanders who had proven their competence through years of training and preparation. The young Shah, who had inherited a fragmented empire, now stood at the threshold of a conflict that would determine whether his quiet revolution had created the foundation for lasting strength, or merely delayed the inevitable collapse of the Safavid dynasty. The armies that gathered under his banners represented not merely a military force but a new vision of Persian civilization, one that combined the ancient traditions of the empire with the modern techniques necessary for survival in a changing world. In the silence of the pre-dawn hours, as the first light of morning began to illuminate the mountains that surrounded the capital, Abbas offered his prayers for the success of the campaign that would either vindicate his reforms or sweep them away in the chaos of defeat. The empire he had inherited as a boy was about to be tested by the man he'd become, and the fate of millions would depend on whether the foundations he had built could withstand the storms that lay ahead. The transformation was complete, but the true test was only beginning. In the distance, the war drums of the Ottoman Empire echoed across the highlands, calling Abbas and his reformed state to prove themselves worthy of the legacy they claimed to inherit. The boy who had once traced the edges of ancient maps would now attempt to redraw the boundaries of his empire with the sword, guided by the wisdom he had gained and the institutions he had created during years of patient preparation. The morning wind carried with it the scent of change, the promise of glory, and the shadow of uncertainty that accompanies all great endeavours. Abbas had spent a decade building the tools of empire. Now he would discover whether those tools were sufficient to restore Persia to its ancient greatness, or whether the forces arrayed against him would prove stronger than the reforms he had so carefully constructed. The ancient city of Isfahan stretched along the Zayandeh River like a jewel waiting to be polished. In the year 1598, Shah Abbas made a decision that would echo through the corridors of time. He would move his capital from the mountain stronghold of Qazvin to this fertile plain, transforming Isfahan into the beating heart of his empire. The Shah walked through the dusty streets of the old city, his keen eyes seeing not what was but what could be. Under the gentle guidance of his vision, craftsmen and architects arrived from across the known world. Armenian merchants brought their skills in trade and finance, while Persian artisans carried forward the ancient traditions of their fathers. The sound of hammers and chisels became the city's new symphony, each strike echoing Abbas's dream of creating a capital that would rival any on earth. The great Meydan-e Jahan, the royal square, began to take shape under Abbas's careful supervision. This vast rectangle, stretching over 500 meters in length and 150 in width, would become the centerpiece of his new city. The Shah envisioned it as more than mere architecture. It would be a stage upon which the drama of Persian life would unfold for generations to come. On the south side of the square, the magnificent Imam Mosque began to rise. Its azure tiles caught the morning light like fragments of sky fallen to earth. The mosque's towering minarets reached toward heaven, their surfaces adorned with calligraphy that flowed like frozen music. Abbas himself would often stand in the construction site as the sun set, watching the artisans apply each tile with the patience of angels, their hands guided by centuries of tradition. The western wall of the square housed the Ali Kapu Palace, from whose balcony Abbas would watch the celebrations and ceremonies that filled the square below. The palace's 6 stories rose like a mountain of marble and wood, each level more intricate than the last. In the music room on the highest floor, the walls were carved with countless niches shaped like musical instruments, creating an acoustic wonder that would carry the softest whisper to every corner of the chamber. Along the eastern side, the delicate Sheikh Lotfola Mosque emerged as a jewel of more intimate proportions. Unlike the grand congregational mosque on the square's southern border, this smaller sanctuary was intended for the Shah's private devotions. Its dome, covered in cream and yellow tiles, seemed to glow with inner light, and the calligraphy that spiraled around its entrance spoke of divine love in flowing Persian script. The northern arcade of the square welcomed merchants and craftsmen from across the world. Here, the great bazaar extended its labyrinthine passages, connecting the royal square to the ancient heart of the city. The vaulted ceilings of the bazaar created a cool sanctuary from the desert heat, while shafts of sunlight filtered through openings above, illuminating the goods that merchants had carried from China, India, and the distant shores of Europe. Abbas understood that a great city required more than magnificent buildings. It needed the breath of life that only water could provide. He ordered the construction of an intricate system of channels and gardens that would bring the life-giving waters of the Zayanda River throughout the city. The sound of flowing water became Isfahan's constant companion, bubbling through garden courtyards and reflecting pools that mirrored the sky above. The Shah Abbas, or Four Gardens Avenue, stretched from the royal square southward across the river, lined with plane trees and watered by streams that ran along its sides. This grand promenade became the city's social heart, where nobles and merchants would stroll in the cool of evening, their conversations mixing with the gentle splash of fountains and the rustle of leaves overhead. As the years passed, Abbas's vision materialized with breathtaking beauty. The city's population swelled to nearly 600,000 souls, making it one of the largest cities in the world. Armenians, Georgians, Indians, and Europeans walked the same streets, their diverse languages creating a cosmopolitan symphony that reflected the empire's broad reach. The Persian saying arose during these golden years, Isfahan nisfe jahan ast, Isfahan is half the world. This was no mere boast, but a recognition of the city's unique position as a crossroads of culture, commerce, and artistic achievement. Visitors from distant lands would write home of streets paved with marble, of gardens where nightingales sang among roses, of markets where silk from China lay beside spices from India and precious stones from the mountains of Persia. The transformation of Isfahan represented more than urban planning. It embodied Abbas's vision of a unified Persian identity. The city's architecture blended elements from across the empire, creating a distinctly Safavid style that would influence Islamic architecture for centuries. The blue and yellow tiles that adorned the mosques reflected the colours of the Persian sky and sun, while the geometric patterns spoke of mathematical precision and spiritual harmony. In the royal workshops established throughout the city, artists created masterpieces that would become treasures of world art. Carpet weavers worked at their looms with silk threads dyed in jewel tones, creating patterns so intricate that each carpet became a meditation on beauty itself. The famous Isfahan carpets, with their hunting scenes and garden motifs, would grace the palaces of kings and the homes of merchants from London to Beijing. The city's hammams, or public baths, became centres of social life, where citizens gathered not merely for cleanliness, but for conversation and relaxation. The domed chambers, lit by star-shaped openings in the ceiling, created an atmosphere of quiet contemplation. The warm waters and aromatic oils provided respite from the cares of daily life, while the geometric tile work that covered the walls spoke of divine order and eternal beauty. Abbas personally supervised many aspects of the city's development, often walking through the construction sites to speak with craftsmen and observe their work. His attention to detail extended from the grandest monuments to the humblest residential districts. He understood that a great city required not only magnificent public buildings, but also comfortable homes for its citizens, efficient systems for water and waste, and markets that could supply the needs of a diverse population. The bridges that Abbas commissioned to span the Zayanda River became architectural marvels in their own right. The Sio-Sipol, or Bridge of 33 Arches, created a graceful span across the water, its reflection doubling its beauty in the river below. These bridges served not only as practical links between the city's districts, but as gathering places where citizens could enjoy the cool evening air and watch the sun set over the water. As Isfahan took shape, it became a magnet for scholars, poets, and artists from across the Islamic world. The city's libraries accumulated manuscripts from across the known world, while its schools attracted students eager to learn from the finest teachers of their age. The court became a centre of intellectual discourse, where philosophy, poetry, and science flourished under the Shah's patronage. The transformation of Isfahan demonstrated Abbas's understanding that true power rested not merely in military might, but in the creation of beauty and the fostering of human achievement. The city became a living testament to the heights that human civilization could reach when guided by wisdom and sustained by just governance. Within the workshops and academies of Isfahan, a cultural renaissance bloomed like flowers in a carefully tended garden. Shah Abbas understood that the strength of an empire lay not merely in its armies or its treasuries, but in the depth of its cultural achievements. Under his patronage, Persian civilization entered a golden age that would rival the greatest cultural flowering in human history. The Shah's court became a magnet for artists, poets, and scholars from across the known world. Persian miniature painting reached new heights of sophistication during this period, with artists like Reza Abbasi developing techniques that would influence Islamic art for centuries. These delicate paintings, often no larger than a book page, captured entire worlds in their jewel-like colours and intricate details. In the royal atelier, painters worked by the soft light of oil lamps, their brushes creating scenes of courtly life, epic battles, and mystical visions. The painting showed young lovers meeting in rose gardens, fierce warriors mounted on prancing horses, and wise kings receiving supplicants in palatial settings. Each miniature was a window into the Persian soul, revealing the culture's deep appreciation for beauty, poetry, and the mysteries of existence. The technique of Persian miniature painting during Abbas's reign achieved a perfect balance between realism and stylization. Artists used gold leaf to illuminate manuscripts, creating pages that seemed to glow with inner light. The colours, ultramarine blue, vermilion red, and brilliant gold, were derived from precious materials imported from across the empire and beyond. Lapis lazuli came from the mountains of Afghanistan, while cinnabar arrived from distant China. Poetry flourished in this environment of cultural encouragement. The court supported dozens of poets who composed verses in Persian, Arabic, and Turkish. These bards gathered in the evening sessions called bazm, where they would recite their latest compositions while musicians provided subtle accompaniment. The themes of their poetry range from mystical love to earthly passion, from the beauty of nature to the complexities of court life. The great poet Sibeh Tabrizi, who lived during Abbas's reign, created ghazals of such beauty that they were memorized and recited throughout the Persian-speaking world. His verses captured the essence of Persian sensibility, the love of gardens and roses, the fascination with the interplay of light and shadow, the quest for spiritual meaning in earthly existence. When Saib wrote of the nightingale's song or the morning dew on rose petals, he was expressing the deepest yearnings of the Persian heart. The musical traditions of Persia also flourished under Abbas's patronage. The court musicians gathered from across the empire created a distinctive Safavid style that blended Persian classical traditions with influences from Arab, Turkish, and Indian music. The primary instruments included the santur, hammered dulcimer, the sitar, long-necked lute, and the ney, reed flute, each capable of producing the subtle microtonal variations that gave Persian music its distinctive character. Musical performances in Abbas's court followed ancient Persian traditions of improvisation within established modal frameworks called dastgah. These musical modes, each associated with specific emotional states and times of day, provided structures within which musicians could explore infinite variations. A skilled performer could evoke the melancholy of autumn, the joy of spring, or the mystical ecstasy of spiritual union through subtle changes in rhythm, melody, and ornamentation. The art of calligraphy reached new heights during this period, with masters like Mirimad al-Hassani creating works that combined spiritual meaning with visual beauty. Persian calligraphy was considered the highest of the visual arts, capable of expressing both the literal meaning of words and their deeper spiritual significance. The flowing lines of Nastaliq script seemed to dance across the page, creating compositions that were simultaneously readable text and abstract art. Calligraphers worked with reed pens cut from specific plants, using inks made from soot and rosewater. The preparation of materials was itself a meditative practice, requiring patience and precision. The most skilled calligraphers could write entire poems in shapes that reflected their content. A ghazal about roses might be written in the form of a flower, while verses about the beloved's hair might flow in long, curved lines across the page. The textile arts reached unprecedented sophistication during Abbas's reign. The royal workshops produced silk fabrics of such beauty that they were sought after by European royalty and Asian potentates alike. Persian silk, woven with gold and silver threads, created patterns that seemed to capture the essence of paradise gardens. The designs often featured hunting scenes, with horsemen pursuing deer through forests of stylized trees, or garden scenes with flowing streams and blooming flowers. The technique of silk weaving involved extraordinary skill and patience. Weavers worked at looms that could accommodate thousands of threads, creating fabrics with up to 400 knots per square inch. The most prized pieces took months or even years to complete, with each thread carefully positioned to create patterns of breathtaking complexity. The finished fabrics seemed to shimmer with life, their colours changing subtly as light moved across their surfaces. Carpet weaving, already a Persian specialty, reached new artistic heights during this period. The famous Isfahan carpets combined technical perfection with artistic vision, creating pieces that were both functional floor coverings and works of art. The designs often featured central medallions surrounded by intricate borders, with patterns that could be read as both geometric abstractions and stylized representations of gardens, hunting scenes, or cosmic diagrams. The creation of a royal carpet was a collaborative effort involving dozens of skilled artisans. The cartoon, or design, was created by a master artist who determined the overall composition and colour scheme. Weavers then worked from this design, tying each knot by hand according to the pattern. The finest carpets used silk threads, and incorporated gold and silver elements, creating surfaces that seemed to glow with inner light. Metalworking arts flourished under Abbas's patronage, with craftsmen creating objects that combined practical function with artistic beauty. Persian metalworkers were particularly skilled in the technique of inlay, where precious metals were hammered into grooves cut in brass or steel surfaces. The resulting patterns often featured calligraphic inscriptions, geometric designs, or stylized plant motifs that reflected the same aesthetic principles found in other Persian arts. The production of illuminated manuscripts reached new heights during this period. The Royal Library commissioned copies of classic Persian texts, each decorated with miniature paintings and calligraphic ornaments. The most famous of these manuscripts was a copy of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the epic poem that told the mythical history of Persia. This manuscript, with its hundreds of miniature paintings depicting heroes and kings, battles and celebrations, became one of the greatest treasures of Persian art. The creation of an illuminated manuscript was a complex process that could take years to complete. First, the paper was prepared using traditional methods that created a smooth, durable surface. Then the text was copied by master calligraphers, leaving spaces for illustrations. Finally, painters created the miniature paintings, using techniques passed down through generations of masters. The finished manuscript was then bound in leather covers, decorated with gold tooling and geometric patterns. Architecture during Abbas's reign reflected the same aesthetic principles found in the other arts. The architectural style that emerged, known as Safavid architecture, created a distinctive Persian identity that drew from various regional traditions while maintaining overall unity. The use of coloured tiles, geometric patterns, and calligraphic inscriptions created buildings that were both functional and spiritually uplifting. The gardens created during this period represented a unique fusion of practical landscaping and artistic vision. Persian garden design followed ancient principles that divided space into geometric sections watered by flowing streams. These gardens were conceived as earthly representations of paradise, with their fourfold divisions symbolizing the 4 rivers of Eden. The combination of water, shade, flowers, and fruit trees created environments that provided both physical comfort and spiritual refreshment. The intellectual life of Abbas's court attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. The Royal Library accumulated thousands of manuscripts on subjects ranging from philosophy and theology to mathematics and astronomy. Scholars engaged in debates that explored the deepest questions of existence, often combining Islamic theology with Persian philosophical traditions and Greek philosophical methods. The translation movement that flourished during this period made Persian literature accessible to a broader audience while also introducing foreign works to Persian readers. Sanskrit texts were translated into Persian, while Persian works were rendered into Arabic and Turkish. This intellectual exchange enriched Persian culture, while also spreading Persian influence throughout the Islamic world. The cultural achievements of Abbas's reign created a legacy that would influence Persian civilization for centuries. The aesthetic principles developed during this period, the love of geometric pattern, the integration of calligraphy and visual art, the creation of garden-like environments, became defining characteristics of Persian culture. The works created under Abbas's patronage would inspire artists and craftsmen for generations, while the cultural institutions he established would continue to foster artistic achievement long after his death. Beyond the azure tiles and flowing gardens of Isfahan, Shah Abbas cast his gaze toward distant horizons, where European ships appeared like white birds on the endless blue of the Persian Gulf. the Shah understood that the strength of his empire would depend not only on military might and cultural achievement, but on the careful cultivation of trade relationships and diplomatic alliances that could bring prosperity to his people and security to his borders. The arrival of European merchants and diplomats in Abbas's court marked the beginning of a new era in Persian history. These pale-skinned strangers from distant lands brought with them not only exotic goods, but also new ideas about commerce, technology, and statecraft. The Shah received them with the careful attention of a ruler who understood that the future belonged to those who could adapt to a changing world. The Portuguese had been the first Europeans to establish a significant presence in Persian waters, but their initial arrogance and attempts to control trade routes had created friction with local merchants. Abbas recognized that the Portuguese fleet, while formidable, was overstretched across vast distances. He began to explore relationships with other European powers who might serve as counterweights to Portuguese influence. The English East India Company's representatives arrived in Isfahan bearing gifts and proposals that intrigued the Shah. Unlike the Portuguese, who sought to dominate trade routes through force, the English offered partnership and mutual benefit. Their ships could carry Persian silk to European markets, while their merchants could provide access to goods from the New World and the far reaches of Asia. Sir Anthony Shirley, one of the first English envoys to reach Abbas's court, found himself in a world of unprecedented luxury and sophistication. The Persian court's ceremonies, with their elaborate protocols and symbolic meanings, impressed the English ambassador even as he struggled to understand their deeper significance. The Shah received him in the Ali Kapu Palace, where the morning light streamed through jewelled windows to illuminate walls covered in mirror work and gold leaf. The diplomatic negotiations that followed required delicate balancing of interests and cultural sensitivities. Abbas sought European military technology and expertise, particularly in the manufacture of firearms and artillery. The Europeans desired access to Persian silk, which was considered the finest in the world, and safe passage for their merchant ships through Persian-controlled waters. The Shah's diplomatic strategy extended beyond mere commercial agreements. He understood that the European powers were engaged in their own complex rivalries, and that Persia could benefit by carefully managing these relationships, by playing English interests against Portuguese, and later Dutch against English. Abbas ensured that no single European power could dominate Persian trade or politics. The Dutch Republic, emerging as a major commercial power, sent its own envoys to negotiate trading agreements with Abbas. The Dutch East India Company offered advantages that neither the Portuguese nor the English could match. A vast network of trading posts, sophisticated financial instruments, and a republican government that was less likely to make unreasonable territorial demands. The cultural exchange that accompanied these diplomatic relationships enriched both Persian and European civilizations. Persian carpets, silk fabrics, and precious stones found their way into European palaces and aristocratic homes, while European weapons, telescopes, and mechanical devices appeared in Persian workshops and armories. The cross-pollination of ideas and technologies accelerated innovations in both civilizations. Abbas's court became a cosmopolitan centre where Persian nobles mingled with European merchants, where Islamic scholars debated with Christian priests, and where the artistic traditions of East and West influenced each other in subtle but profound ways. The Shah encouraged this cultural mixing, understanding that isolation led to stagnation, while openness fostered growth and innovation. The economic benefits of these trading relationships transformed the Persian economy. Persian silk, produced in the northern provinces and woven in the workshops of Isfahan, became one of the most sought-after luxury goods in European markets. The profits from silk exports funded the construction of new buildings, the maintenance of roads and caravanserais, and the expansion of the Persian military. The overland trade routes that connected Persia to both Europe and Asia flourished under Abbas's careful management. The Great Silk Road, which had connected east and west for centuries, experienced a revival as Persian merchants, protected by the Shah's armies and encouraged by his policies, carried goods across vast distances. Caravanserais, fortified inns that provided shelter for merchants and their animals, were built at regular intervals along these routes. These caravanserais became centres of cultural exchange where merchants from different civilizations shared information, languages and customs. A typical caravanserai might shelter Persian silk merchants travelling to Aleppo, Indian spice traders heading to Istanbul, and European factors carrying silver from the Americas. The conversations around evening fires mixed languages and ideas, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that reflected the interconnected nature of the early modern world. The Persian Gulf became a crucial theatre for Abbas's diplomatic and commercial strategy. The port of Bandar Abbas, named in the Shah's honour, became a major commercial centre where European ships loaded Persian goods for markets in India, Southeast Asia, and, ultimately, Europe. The revenues from port duties and customs fees provided significant income for the Persian treasury. Abbas's naval policy reflected his understanding that control of seaborne trade required more than passive reliance on European partners. He began to develop a Persian naval capability, commissioning ships and training sailors who could protect Persian interests in the Gulf. This naval development represented a significant departure from traditional Persian strategy, which had always focused on land-based power. The diplomatic correspondence between Abbas and European rulers reveals the sophisticated nature of early modern diplomacy. Letters written in Persian, Arabic and Latin crossed vast distances, carrying proposals for military alliances, trade agreements, and cultural exchanges. These documents, often beautifully illuminated and carrying elaborate seals, represented the formalization of relationships that would reshape the medieval world. The Shah's relationship with European military advisors proved particularly significant. Scottish, English, and Italian officers helped modernize the Persian army, introducing new tactics, weapons, and organizational methods. These advisors had to adapt European military innovations to Persian conditions, creating hybrid forms of warfare that combined traditional Persian strengths with modern European techniques. The religious dimensions of these diplomatic relationships required careful management. Abbas, as a Shia Muslim ruler, had to navigate relationships with Christian European powers while maintaining his legitimacy among his Muslim subjects. He demonstrated remarkable religious tolerance, allowing European merchants to practice their faith privately while ensuring that public Islamic observances remained undisturbed. The Armenian merchants, who served as intermediaries between Persian and European traders, played a crucial role in these diplomatic and commercial relationships. Their Christian faith allowed them to interact easily with European merchants, while their long residence in Persia had given them deep understanding of Persian customs and business practices. Abbas's policy of protecting and encouraging Armenian merchants demonstrated his pragmatic approach to religious diversity. The technological transfer that accompanied these diplomatic relationships had profound long-term consequences for Persian civilization. European innovations in metallurgy, printing, and navigation gradually found their way into Persian workshops and schools. At the same time, Persian techniques in textile production, garden design, and architectural decoration influenced European artists and craftsmen. The diplomatic protocols developed during Abbas's reign established precedents that would influence Persian foreign relations for centuries. The elaborate ceremonies that surrounded the reception of foreign ambassadors, the carefully negotiated terms of trade agreements, and the delicate balance maintained between different European powers all reflected the sophisticated nature of Persian statecraft. The intelligence networks that Abbas developed to monitor European activities demonstrated his understanding that successful diplomacy required accurate information about foreign intentions and capabilities. Persian merchants travelling widely throughout the known world provided valuable intelligence about European military developments, economic conditions, and political changes. The cultural productions that emerge from these diplomatic relationships, travel accounts, diplomatic correspondence, and artistic works that reflected cross-cultural influences, provide valuable insights into the early modern world. These documents reveal the complex negotiations required to bridge different civilizations, the misunderstandings that arose from cultural differences, and the gradual development of mutual respect and understanding. The legacy of Abbas's diplomatic achievements extended far beyond his own reign. The trading relationships he established provided a foundation for Persian economic development that would continue for centuries. The cultural exchanges he encouraged enriched Persian civilization, while also contributing to the broader development of human knowledge and artistic achievement. The diplomatic precedents he set would influence Persian foreign policy long after his death, establishing principles of pragmatic engagement with foreign powers that would serve Persian interests through changing historical circumstances. As the 17th century progressed through its second decade, Shah Abbas stood at the pinnacle of his power, his empire stretching from the shores of the Caspian Sea to the warm waters of the Persian Gulf, from the ancient cities of Mesopotamia to the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. The transformation he had wrought in Persian society, military organization, and international relations had created a realm that commanded respect from both ancient enemies and distant allies. The military reforms that Abbas had implemented over the previous decades had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the region. The traditional tribal levies, with their seasonal availability and divided loyalties, had been supplemented by a professional standing army that served the crown directly. This new military structure, known as the Ghulam system, created a force that was both technically advanced and personally loyal to the Shah. The centerpiece of this military revolution was the corps of musketeers, trained by European advisors but adapted to Persian conditions and tactics. These soldiers, equipped with the latest firearms and organized in disciplined units, could deliver devastating volleys against traditional cavalry charges. The sound of their synchronized firing became a signature of Persian military might, echoing across battlefields from the Caucasus to the Arabian Peninsula. The artillery corps, another innovation of Abbas's reign, provided Persian armies with firepower that could breach the strongest fortifications. The great cannon cast in the foundries of Isfahan under the guidance of European technicians could hurl stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds against enemy walls. The psychological impact of these weapons often proved as decisive as their physical effects, as the thunder of their firing and the destruction they caused could break enemy morale before the main battle began. The cavalry, though no longer the dominant arm of the Persian military, remained a crucial component of Abbas's forces. The traditional Persian horsemen, skilled in the techniques of mounted archery and swift maneuvering, were reorganized into units that could support the musketeer formations and exploit opportunities created by artillery bombardments. Their mobility allowed Persian armies to concentrate rapidly at threatened points while maintaining the flexibility to pursue defeated enemies. The siege warfare capabilities that Abbas developed during this period enabled Persian forces to capture fortified cities that had previously been considered impregnable. The combination of European engineering techniques with Persian logistical expertise created a system that could maintain lengthy sieges while protecting the attacking forces from enemy counterattacks. The fall of Baghdad in 1623, after a siege that lasted several months, demonstrated the effectiveness of these new methods. The recapture of Baghdad from the Ottomans represented more than a military victory. It was a symbolic triumph that resonated throughout the Islamic world. The city of the caliphs, the ancient seat of Muslim power, had returned to Persian control after centuries of foreign rule. Abbas entered the city in triumph, his banners flying from the same walls that had once sheltered Harun al-Rashid and the heroes of the Arabian Nights. The administrative system that Abbas had developed to govern his expanded empire demonstrated his understanding that military conquest required effective civilian administration. The provincial governors, carefully selected for their loyalty and competence, implemented policies that balanced local autonomy with central control. This system allowed the empire to maintain unity while accommodating the diverse ethnic and religious groups that comprised its population. The financial foundations of Abbas's power rested on the careful management of trade revenues and agricultural production. The taxes collected from merchants using the improved road system, the customs duties levied at Persian ports, and the revenues from the royal workshops all contributed to a treasury that could support both military campaigns and cultural projects. The economic prosperity of the empire provided the resources necessary to maintain its military superiority and diplomatic influence. The intelligence networks that Abbas had established throughout his reign provided him with information about enemy movements, diplomatic negotiations, and commercial opportunities. Persian merchants travelling throughout the known world reported on political developments in distant lands, while the diplomatic correspondence maintained with European courts provided insights into the changing balance of power in the West. The cultural achievements of Abbas's reign reached their zenith during this period of political and military success. The workshops of Isfahan produced artistic masterpieces that combine technical perfection with aesthetic beauty, while the court poets composed verses that celebrated the glory of the Safavid dynasty and the achievements of Persian civilization. The synthesis of military power and cultural achievement created a golden age that would be remembered for centuries. The religious policies that Abbas implemented during this period reflected his understanding that spiritual unity was essential to political stability. While maintaining the Shia character of his empire, he demonstrated remarkable tolerance toward religious minorities, understanding that diversity of belief could coexist with loyalty to the state. The Armenian merchants, the Jewish communities, and even some Sunni Muslim groups found protection under his rule. The architectural projects completed during these years of prosperity created monuments that would endure for centuries. The completion of the Imam Mosque in Isfahan, with its soaring dome and intricate tilework, provided a spiritual centre for the empire that was also a masterpiece of artistic achievement. The mosque's acoustic properties, carefully designed to carry the human voice throughout its vast interior, demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of both engineering and aesthetics that characterized Persian architecture. The urban planning that transformed Isfahan during this period created a city that was both functionally efficient and aesthetically pleasing. The system of bazaars, caravanserais, and public buildings created an urban environment that could accommodate the needs of a diverse population, while maintaining the beauty that made Isfahan famous throughout the known world. The integration of residential areas with commercial districts, of public spaces with private gardens, created a model of urban development that would influence city planning for centuries. The diplomatic relationships that Abbas maintained with European powers reached new levels of sophistication during this period. The mutual respect that had developed between Persian and European negotiators created a framework for cooperation that benefited both sides. The technology transfer that resulted from these relationships accelerated innovations in both military and civilian spheres, while the cultural exchange enriched artistic traditions throughout the participating civilizations. The naval developments that Abbas sponsored during this period gave Persia a maritime capability that had been lacking in previous centuries. The Persian Gulf, once dominated by foreign fleets, became a Persian lake where merchant ships could sail under the protection of the Shah's naval forces. The revenues from maritime trade provided new sources of income for the imperial treasury, while the strategic position of Persian ports gave the empire influence over the trade routes connecting Asia with Europe. The educational institutions that flourished under Abbas's patronage created a generation of administrators, scholars, and artists who would serve the empire for decades to come. The madrasas of Isfahan, supported by generous endowments, attracted students from throughout the Islamic world, while the royal library accumulated manuscripts that preserved the wisdom of past ages and provided resources for future scholars. The agricultural improvements that Abbas implemented during this period increased the productivity of Persian lands and supported the growing population of the empire. The irrigation systems that brought water to previously barren areas, the introduction of new crops from distant lands, and the improvement of traditional farming techniques all contributed to the prosperity that characterized this golden age. The legal system that Abbas developed during these years balanced traditional Islamic law with the practical needs of a diverse empire. The qadis, or judges, who administered justice in the provinces received training that prepared them to deal with the complex legal issues that arose in a cosmopolitan society. The integration of different legal traditions created a system that was both just and efficient. The peak of Abbas's power was perhaps best demonstrated by the great celebrations that marked important events in the imperial calendar. The New Year festivals, with their elaborate ceremonies and public festivities, brought together all levels of society in celebrations that lasted for weeks. The royal processions, with their displays of wealth and power, reminded both subjects and foreign observers of the might of the Persian Empire. Yet even at this moment of triumph, the careful observer might have noticed the first signs of the challenges that would eventually face the empire. The very success of Abbas's reforms had created institutions and expectations that would be difficult for his successors to maintain. The balance between central authority and local autonomy, between military efficiency and cultural achievement, between religious orthodoxy and practical tolerance. All these delicate equilibria would require constant attention and adjustment. The grandeur of Abbas's court, with its elaborate ceremonies and expensive patronage, had created a standard of magnificence that consumed enormous resources. The military machine that had brought such spectacular victories required constant funding and attention. The diplomatic relationships that had brought such advantages demanded continuous management and negotiation. The height of power, as Abbas perhaps understood, was also a moment of maximum responsibility and potential vulnerability. As the Shah stood on the balcony of the Ali Kapu Palace, looking out over the royal square of Isfahan filled with the bustle of merchants and the activities of daily life, he could see the fruits of his labours stretching in all directions. The empire he had created was more prosperous, more powerful, and more culturally sophisticated than Persia had been for centuries. Yet the shadows were already beginning to lengthen, and the challenges that would test his legacy were beginning to gather on the horizon. The great construction projects that Abbas had initiated during this period would outlast not only his own reign but the dynasty itself. The bridges and bazaars, the mosques and palaces, the gardens and caravanserais, all these physical achievements would continue to serve future generations long after the political circumstances that created them had passed into history. In this sense, the height of Abbas's power was not merely a moment of temporary triumph, but a foundation for lasting achievement that would enrich Persian civilization for centuries to come. The palace halls that had once echoed with the laughter of children now seemed to whisper with the weight of memory. As Abbas entered the 4th decade of his reign, the golden light that had illuminated his court began to cast longer shadows, and within those shadows the Shah would discover that even the mightiest of rulers cannot escape the turning of time's wheel. The year 1615 marked a subtle shift in the rhythm of the empire. While the bazaars of Isfahan still hummed with commerce, and the workshops continued their intricate dance of creation, those who knew the Shah intimately began to notice changes in his demeanour. The man who had once moved through his court with the fluid grace of a dancer now paused longer in doorways, his dark eyes searching faces as if trying to read the future in their expressions. It was during this time that the first of the great personal tragedies would strike the imperial household. Prince Safi Mirza, Abbas's eldest son and the apple of his eye, had grown into a young man of remarkable intelligence and promise. The prince possessed his father's strategic mind, coupled with a gentle nature that endeared him to both courtiers and common people. Abbas had begun to involve him more deeply in matters of state, watching with pride as his son navigated the complexities of governance with wisdom beyond his years. But the very qualities that made Prince Safi Mirza so beloved also made him vulnerable to the machinations of those who sought to curry favour or eliminate potential threats. Whispers began to circulate through the court, subtle suggestions that the prince was growing too popular, too independent, too willing to listen to voices that might not align with his father's vision for the empire. Abbas, despite his legendary intelligence networks and his ability to read the currents of political intrigue, found himself caught in a web of uncertainty regarding his own flesh and blood. The paranoia that had served him well in dealing with external enemies now turned inward, poisoning the very relationships that should have brought him the greatest joy. Late at night, in the privacy of his chambers, the Shah would sit by the window overlooking his beloved gardens, weighing reports and rumours, trying to separate truth from manipulation. The decision, when it came, would haunt Abbas for the remainder of his days. In 1615, acting on information that may have been fabricated by enemies seeking to eliminate a potential rival, Abbas ordered the execution of Prince Safi Mirza. The young man, who had never raised a hand against his father or harboured any treasonous thoughts, was put to death in the dungeons of the royal palace, his crime being nothing more than his potential to one day challenge the established order. The aftermath of this tragedy rippled through the empire like stones thrown into still water. The court, which had grown accustomed to the warm dynamics of a father grooming his son for succession, now moved with a different rhythm, one marked by fear and uncertainty. Abbas himself seemed to age years in the space of months, his hair growing whiter, his steps heavier, as if the weight of his decision had settled permanently upon his shoulders. Yet even in his grief and growing isolation, Abbas continued to govern with the same attention to detail that had characterized his reign. He threw himself into administrative reforms with renewed vigor, as if by perfecting the machinery of government he could somehow balance the scales of personal loss. New regulations were implemented for the collection of taxes, the organization of the military and the management of trade routes. Each decree bore the mark of his careful consideration. Each policy reflected his deep understanding of the empire's needs. The loss of Prince Safi Mirza also created a succession crisis that would plague Abbas for the remainder of his reign. His other sons, Prince Tahmasp and Prince Darius, were younger and less prepared for the responsibilities of rule. More troubling still, the execution of their eldest brother had filled them with a mixture of fear and resentment that complicated their relationship with their father. They moved through the court like shadows, careful not to appear too ambitious, too popular, or too independent, all qualities that had once been encouraged but now seemed dangerous. As the years passed, Abbas found himself increasingly isolated from his family. The natural bonds of affection that should have strengthened with time instead frayed under the weight of suspicion and fear. His remaining sons kept their distance, their wives whispered in corners, and even his daughters, who had once been sources of joy and comfort, now approached him with a careful deference reserved for a sovereign rather than the easy love given to a father. The empire itself continued to prosper, a testament to the solid foundations that Abbas had built during his earlier years. The trade routes functioned smoothly, the military remained loyal and effective, and the administrative systems he had put in place ensured that governance continued even as the personal life of the ruler grew increasingly troubled. Foreign ambassadors still sought audiences in Isfahan, merchants still travelled the length and breadth of the empire, and scholars still gathered in the libraries and academies that Abbas had established. But those who knew the Shah personally could see the changes that the years were bringing. The man who had once been quick to laugh and generous with his praise now seemed to weigh every word, every gesture, every interaction for hidden meanings. The spontaneous visits to the bazaars, the impromptu conversations with craftsmen and merchants, the easy camaraderie with his guards. All of these became less frequent as Abbas retreated into the formal protocols of court life. The death of Prince Safi Mirza had also disrupted the careful balance of power that Abbas had maintained between various factions within the court. Without a clear successor to rally around, different groups began to position themselves for an uncertain future. The Sizilbash tribes, who'd been gradually marginalized in favor of the Ghulams, began to reassert their influence. The Persian bureaucrats, who had become increasingly important in the administration of the empire, started to form their own networks of power. The Ghulams themselves, dependent on the Shah's personal favour, watched nervously as their patron became more unpredictable. Abbas, with his keen understanding of political dynamics, recognised these shifting currents and attempted to manage them through a combination of rewards and punishments, promotions and demotions, grants and confiscations. His policies became more erratic, sometimes favouring one faction over another seemingly without reason, sometimes reversing decisions that had been made only months earlier. The court, which had once operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine, began to show signs of strain. During this period, Abbas also began to show increasing signs of physical decline. The years of campaign and the constant stress of governance had taken their toll on his body. He suffered from gout, which made walking painful, and his digestion became increasingly problematic. The man who had once been known for his physical vitality now required assistance with tasks that had once been effortless. His physicians, the finest in the empire, prescribed various treatments and remedies, but they could do little to reverse the effects of time and stress. Despite his physical ailments, Abbas's mind remained sharp, and he continued to take an active interest in all aspects of governance. He still rose before dawn to review reports from his administrators, still held court to hear petitions from his subjects, still met with foreign ambassadors to discuss matters of trade and diplomacy. But the easy confidence that had once characterized his decisions now seemed tempered by doubt and second-guessing. The execution of Prince Safi Mirza had also created problems with the empire's neighbours. The Ottoman Empire, always watching for signs of weakness in their Persian rivals, began to probe the borders more aggressively. The Uzbeks in the north, who'd been relatively quiet during Abbas's golden years, started to make incursions into Persian territory. The Mughal Empire, while not directly threatening, adopted a more aggressive stance in diplomatic negotiations, sensing that the balance of power in the region might be shifting. Abbas responded to these challenges with characteristic energy, dispatching armies to defend the borders and ambassadors to negotiate with potential adversaries. But those who served him closely could see that the fire that had once burned so brightly was beginning to flicker. His military decisions, while still strategically sound, lacked the innovative brilliance that had marked his earlier campaigns. His diplomatic initiatives, while competent, did not carry the same sense of inevitability that had characterized his golden years. The religious establishment, which had been carefully managed during Abbas's rise to power, also began to assert greater influence during this period. The clerics, recognizing the Shah's growing isolation and the uncertainty surrounding the succession, positioned themselves as guardians of orthodoxy and stability. They began to push for more conservative policies, particularly regarding the empire's Christian minorities and its relationships with European powers. Abbas, who had always been pragmatic in his approach to religion, found himself caught between his desire to maintain the religious legitimacy of his rule and his understanding of the empire's practical needs. The delicate balance he had maintained between different religious communities began to shift as the clerics gained influence. Some of the more liberal policies of his earlier years were quietly reversed, and the atmosphere in the empire became more conservative. The impact of these changes was felt most keenly by the foreign communities that had flourished under Abbas's protection. The Armenian merchants, who'd been crucial to the empire's economic success, began to face increased restrictions and higher taxes. The European traders, who had established thriving businesses in Isfahan and other cities, found themselves subjected to more intensive scrutiny and regulation. The various Christian communities, who had enjoyed relative freedom under Abbas's tolerant policies, began to experience pressure to convert or face marginalization. These changes were not implemented suddenly or dramatically, but rather evolved gradually as the political winds shifted. Abbas, still committed to the empire's prosperity, tried to moderate the more extreme demands of the religious establishment, but his ability to do so was limited by his growing dependence on their support. The result was a series of compromises that satisfied no one completely and created new tensions within the empire. As Abbas entered his 60s, the weight of his years and his losses became increasingly apparent. The man who had once seemed to embody the very essence of royal power now appeared fragile, even vulnerable. His courtiers, who had once competed for his attention and favour, now watched him with a mixture of respect and pity. The foreign ambassadors who met with him reported back to their capitals that the great Shah, while still formidable, was clearly entering the twilight of his reign. The empire itself reflected these changes. While still powerful and prosperous, it had lost some of the dynamism that had characterized the early years of Abbas's rule. The great construction projects continued, but at a slower pace. The military remained effective, but showed signs of institutional fatigue. The administrative systems functioned, but with less efficiency and innovation than before. The empire, like its ruler, seemed to be entering a period of gradual decline. Yet even in this difficult period, Abbas continued to demonstrate the qualities that had made him great. His devotion to his subjects remained unwavering, his attention to their welfare undiminished. He still took personal interest in the smallest details of governance, still insisted on hearing directly from those who served him, still demanded the highest standards of performance from his administrators. The love he had once lavished on his family, now sadly complicated by tragedy and suspicion, found new expression in his relationship with his empire. The question of succession, however, remained unresolved and increasingly urgent. Prince Tahmasp, the eldest surviving son, was showing signs of mental instability that made him unsuitable for rule. Prince Darius, while more stable, lacked the charisma and strategic intelligence that effective leadership required. Both young men lived under the shadow of their executed brother, uncertain of their father's intentions and fearful of making any move that might be interpreted as ambitious. Abbas, recognizing the problems with his potential successors, began to consider alternatives. He looked to his grandsons, particularly Prince Safi, son of the executed prince, as possible candidates for the throne. But the boy was still young, and the idea of a regency during a period of potential instability was troubling. The Shah also considered the possibility of naming one of his brothers or nephews as his successor, but all of these options carried their own risks and complications. The uncertainty surrounding the succession created a sense of unease throughout the empire. Regional governors began to consolidate their power, preparing for the possibility of civil war. Military commanders sought to ensure the loyalty of their troops, unsure of who they might ultimately serve. Merchants and traders, always sensitive to political instability, began to diversify their investments and hedge their bets. As word of the succession crisis spread beyond the empire's borders, foreign powers began to position themselves to take advantage of any potential weakness. The Ottomans increased their military presence along the border, preparing to strike if the opportunity arose. The Uzbeks made diplomatic overtures to various Persian nobles, seeking to create alliances that might benefit them in the event of civil war. The Mughal Empire adopted a wait-and-see approach, ready to support whichever faction seemed likely to emerge victorious. Abbas, aware of these external threats, worked to maintain the empire's defensive capabilities even as he struggled with internal challenges. He reinforced border fortifications, strengthened the loyalty of key military units, and maintained diplomatic relationships with friendly powers. But he knew that the ultimate security of the empire depended on a smooth succession, and this was the one thing he seemed unable to guarantee. The later years of Abbas's reign were also marked by a series of natural disasters that tested the empire's resilience. Droughts in some regions led to crop failures and food shortages. Floods in others destroyed infrastructure and disrupted trade. Earthquakes damaged important cities and required expensive reconstruction efforts. These challenges, while not unprecedented, came at a time when the empire's resources were already stretched and its leadership was under stress. Abbas's response to these crises demonstrated both his continuing competence and his growing limitations. He mobilized the empire's resources effectively, providing relief to affected areas and organizing reconstruction efforts. But the strain of managing these additional challenges, combined with his personal losses and physical decline, clearly took its toll. The man who had once seemed to thrive under pressure now appeared to be struggling under the weight of his responsibilities. The court, reflecting the Shah's changing circumstances, became a more sombre place. The elaborate ceremonies and celebrations that had once been regular features of royal life became less frequent and more formal. The easy interaction between the ruler and his subjects gave way to more rigid protocols and greater distance. The palace, which had once been a centre of innovation and creativity, became more conservative and inward-looking. These changes were not lost on the empire's subjects, who had grown accustomed to the accessibility and dynamism of their ruler. While Abbas remained popular and respected, the relationship between the Shah and his people began to evolve. The easy affection of his earlier years was replaced by a more distant reverence, the spontaneous demonstrations of loyalty by more formal expressions of support. As Abbas approached his 70th year, the reality of his mortality became increasingly apparent to all who knew him. The man who had once seemed invincible now struggled with the basic tasks of daily life. His physicians became constant companions, his movements were carefully monitored, and his public appearances were increasingly rare. The empire, which had been so closely identified with his personal leadership, began to prepare for a future without him. Yet even in his declining years, Abbas continued to show flashes of the brilliance that had made him great. His analysis of political situations remained sharp, his understanding of human nature undiminished. When he chose to act, he could still command with the authority that had once made him the most powerful ruler in the region. But these moments of clarity and energy became increasingly rare, separated by longer periods of fatigue and uncertainty. The tragedy of Abbas's later years lay not in any single dramatic event, but in the gradual accumulation of losses and disappointments. The execution of his eldest son has been the catalyst, but the real damage came from the isolation and suspicion that followed. The man who'd once been surrounded by family and friends now lived largely alone, attended by servants and courtiers, but lacking the genuine human connections that had once sustained him. This personal isolation was reflected in the empire's growing insularity. The openness to foreign ideas and influences that had characterized Abbas's golden years gave way to a more defensive and conservative approach. The empire, while still formidable, began to lose the innovative edge that had made it so successful. The dynamic balance between tradition and change that Abbas had maintained so skillfully began to shift toward tradition and stability. As the 1620s progressed, it became clear that Abbas's reign was entering its final phase. The great projects of his earlier years were largely complete, the major reforms had been implemented, and the empire had achieved a level of stability and prosperity that seemed sustainable. But the question of what would come next remained unanswered, and the shadow of uncertainty grew longer with each passing year. The Shah himself seemed to recognize that his time was drawing to a close. He began to spend more time in reflection, reviewing the accomplishments and failures of his long reign. He consulted with historians and chroniclers, ensuring that the record of his achievements would be preserved for future generations. He also began to make preparations for his eventual succession, though these efforts were complicated by the ongoing uncertainty about who would ultimately inherit the throne. In the mosques and tea houses of Isfahan, in the caravanserais along the trade routes, in the military camps and administrative offices of the empire, people began to speak in hushed tones about the approaching end of an era. Abbas the Great, The man who had transformed Persia from a fragmented collection of territories into a unified and prosperous empire was mortal after all. The question that haunted everyone was whether his achievements would survive his passing, or whether the empire would fragment once again into competing factions and warring tribes. The weight of these concerns pressed heavily on Abbas's shoulders as he entered the final years of his reign. The man who had once carried the burdens of leadership with apparent ease now seemed to struggle under their weight. The crown that had once sat so easily on his head now appeared to be almost too heavy to bear. The empire that had once seemed to be the natural extension of his will now required constant effort to maintain and control. Yet even in his declining years, Abbas remained committed to the welfare of his subjects and the prosperity of his empire. He continued to make decisions, to implement policies, to respond to challenges with the same careful attention to detail that had always characterized his rule. The fire that had once burned so brightly might have dimmed, but it had not been extinguished. The great Shah, even in his weakness, remained a formidable leader and a devoted servant of his people. As the sun set over the gardens of Isfahan, casting long shadows across the courtyards and reflecting pools that Abbas had created, the empire he had built continued to function with the efficiency and grace that he had instilled in it. The merchants still traded, the soldiers still stood guard, the administrators still governed, and the people still went about their daily lives with the security and prosperity that his leadership had provided. The question that remained was whether this golden age would continue after its creator was gone, or whether the shadows now lengthening across the empire would eventually consume the light that Abbas had worked so hard to kindle. In the quiet moments of the evening, as the call to prayer echoed across the city and the lights began to twinkle in the darkness, Abbas would sit in his private chambers and contemplate the legacy he would leave behind. The empire he had built, the reforms he had implemented, the prosperity he had created. All of these were substantial achievements that would endure long after he was gone. But the personal cost of his success, the family he had lost, the isolation he had endured, the suspicions that had poisoned his relationships, these too were part of his story, and they weighed heavily on his heart as he prepared for the final chapter of his remarkable life. The master of Isfahan felt the stone beneath his feet grow heavier with each passing season. In the final decade of his reign, Abbas moved through his palace corridors like a figure carved from memory itself, his steps measured by the rhythm of decades rather than days. The man who had once danced across battlefields now found his greatest battles fought in the quiet chambers of his own soul, where the echoes of 1,000 decisions whispered their judgments in the pre-dawn darkness. The year 1620 marked a turning point in the Shah's physical vitality. Court physicians spoke in hushed tones of ailments that seemed to multiply like shadows at sunset. His hands, once steady enough to draw a bow at full gallop, now trembled when he lifted his morning tea. The body that had endured countless campaigns, survived assassination attempts, and weathered the storms of political intrigue began to show the accumulated weight of a life lived at the edge of possibility. Yet even as his physical form grew frail, Abbas's mind remained sharp as Damascus steel. He spent longer hours in his private study, poring over maps that showed the extent of his transformed realm. The borders he had secured, the cities he had rebuilt, the trade routes he had established, all spread before him like a vast tapestry woven from his own will and vision. In these solitary moments he would trace the borders of his empire with fingers that remembered the texture of sword hilts and the weight of crowns. The question of succession haunted these twilight years like a spectre that refused to be banished. Abbas had witnessed the destruction that weak or contested succession could bring to an empire. The Ottoman struggles, the Mughal fractures, the European wars of inheritance all served as stark reminders of what awaited a realm without clear leadership. Yet the very measures he had taken to protect his throne had eliminated the natural heirs who might have provided that clarity. Prince Tahmasp, his surviving son, had been raised in the careful isolation that Abbas deemed necessary for royal safety. The young man possessed intelligence and showed flashes of the iron will that ran in Safavid blood, but he lacked the battle-hardened experience that had forged his father's character. Abbas watched his son with the careful eye of a master craftsman, examining an unfinished work, knowing that time was running short for the final shaping that would be required. The administrative machinery of the empire continued to function with the precision that Abbas had spent decades perfecting. His ghulams, now seasoned administrators in their own right, carried out the daily governance that kept the vast realm functioning. Trade flowed along the Silk Roads, taxes were collected with efficient regularity, and the network of spies and informants that had served as the empire's nervous system continued to pulse with information from every corner of the known world. But Abbas could sense the subtle changes that crept into the system, like hairline cracks in a seemingly solid wall. The very success of his centralized administration had created a dependency on his personal authority that would prove difficult to transfer. Officials who had learned to look to Isfahan for every significant decision would struggle to adapt to a new ruler with different methods and priorities. The Shah's religious policies during these final years reflected a man grappling with questions of mortality and legacy. His treatment of religious minorities had always been complex, balancing political necessity with personal conviction. Now, as he contemplated the judgment that awaited all mortals, he seemed to seek a middle path that would honour both the Shia faith that defined his dynasty and the diverse communities that populated his realm. Armenian merchants continued to thrive in their new Julfa quarter, their success a testament to Abbas's recognition that economic prosperity transcended religious boundaries. The Christian communities that had been relocated during his early campaigns had established themselves as integral parts of the empire's commercial network. Jewish merchants and artisans found protection under laws that recognized their contributions to the realm's wealth and culture. Yet the pressure from Orthodox clerics never ceased entirely. They whispered that the Shah's tolerance of religious diversity would bring divine judgment upon the realm. Abbas listened to these concerns with the patience of a man who had learned to weigh spiritual convictions against practical necessities. His response was characteristically nuanced, maintaining the essential Shia character of the state while preserving the religious flexibility that has proven so economically beneficial. The great construction projects that had transformed Isfahan continued even as their patron's health declined. The Chehel Sotun Palace, with its hall of 40 columns, rose as a testament to the Persian architectural renaissance that Abbas had fostered. The building's design reflected the synthesis of influences that characterized his reign, traditional Persian forms enhanced by elements learned from Ottoman, Mughal, and European sources. Gardens remained a particular passion of the aging Shah. The paradise gardens of Isfahan, with their careful balance of water, shade, and flowering plants, offered a foretaste of the divine paradise that awaited the faithful. Abbas would spend hours in these spaces, sometimes alone, sometimes in the company of poets and musicians who understood that their role was to enhance rather than disturb the contemplative atmosphere. The sound of water flowing through carefully engineered channels provided a constant accompaniment to his meditations. These were the sounds of civilization triumphant. Water brought to bloom in the desert, order imposed upon chaos, beauty created from the raw materials of stone and soil. In the murmur of fountains and the whisper of wind through plane trees, Abbas found a peace that had eluded him during the tumultuous years of conquest and consolidation. The year 1623 brought news that stirred the old fire in Abbas's veins. Ottoman forces, sensing perhaps that the great Shah was no longer the formidable opponent of his prime, had begun probing the northwestern frontiers. Reports reached Isfahan of border raids, of vast Kurdish tribes being turned against Persian interests, of Ottoman governors speaking openly of reclaiming territories lost during the great campaigns of previous decades. Abbas's response was swift and decisive. Despite the concerns of his physicians and the gentle protests of his closest advisers, he announced his intention to personally lead one final expedition against the Ottoman threat. The decision sent ripples of both excitement and anxiety through the court and the broader empire. The aging lion of Persia would once more take the field, but those who knew him best could see the cost that such an effort would exact. The preparation for this campaign differed markedly from those of earlier years. Where once Abbas had thrown himself into the logistics of war with boundless energy, now he relied more heavily on his experienced generals and administrators. The Ghulam officers who had learned warfare at his side took on greater responsibility for organizing supplies, coordinating with provincial governors, and ensuring that the vast machinery of military mobilization functioned smoothly. The army that assembled for what would prove to be Abbas's final campaign was a mature force that reflected the military innovations of his reign. The artillery corps, trained by European specialists, had reached a level of proficiency that made Persian cannons feared throughout the region. The Ghulam cavalry, disciplined and loyal, provided the mobile striking force that had proven so effective in previous conflicts. The musketeers, organized and equipped according to the latest European models, gave the Persian army a firepower advantage that few regional opponents could match. Abbas himself, despite his physical limitations, insisted on maintaining the ceremonial aspects of royal leadership that had always been central to his military success. He appeared before his troops in the full regalia of Persian kingship, his presence alone sufficient to inspire confidence in soldiers who had followed him through countless victories. The sight of their Shah, crowned and mounted, ready once more to lead them into battle, created a surge of loyalty that transcended mere military discipline. The campaign itself unfolded with the methodical precision that had characterized Abbas's later military efforts. Rather than seeking the dramatic cavalry charges and bold tactical strokes of his youth, he now employed a more measured approach that maximized his advantages while minimizing risks. The army advanced in carefully planned stages, securing supply lines, establishing defensive positions, and gradually tightening the noose around Ottoman strongholds. The siege of Baghdad, recaptured in 1623, became the crowning achievement of this final campaign. The city that had eluded Abbas's grasp in earlier years finally fell to a combination of military pressure and diplomatic isolation. The Ottoman garrison, cut off from reinforcement and facing a siege conducted with all the technical expertise that Persian military engineers had accumulated over decades, eventually surrendered rather than face the certain destruction that awaited them. The recapture of Baghdad resonated throughout the Islamic world as a symbol of Persian resurgence and Ottoman decline. The city, with its rich history as a centre of Islamic learning and culture, represented far more than a mere military objective. Its return to Persian control demonstrated that the Safavid Empire remained a formidable force, capable of projecting power across the vast distances that separated its core territories from the contested borderlands. For Abbas personally, the victory at Baghdad provided a fitting capstone to his military career. The city that had represented one of his few significant failures had finally been brought within the Persian sphere. The symbolic importance of this achievement seemed to energize the aging Shah, giving him a renewed sense of purpose and accomplishment that temporarily masked the physical toll that the campaign had exacted. Yet those closest to Abbas could see the cost of this final military effort. The long hours in the saddle, the stress of command, the constant pressure of maintaining the royal presence that inspired his troops, all combined to accelerate the decline that had been gradually overtaking the great ruler. His physicians spoke privately of symptoms that suggested his body's reserves were finally reaching their limits. The return journey to Isfahan became a triumphal progress that celebrated both the immediate victory and the broader achievements of Abbas's reign. Cities along the route prepared elaborate welcomes for their returning Shah, with ceremonies that recalled the great victories of previous decades. The people who lined the roads to catch a glimpse of their ruler saw in his weathered face and bearing the accumulated wisdom and experience of a lifetime spent in service to the Persian crown. As the familiar skyline of Isfahan appeared on the horizon, Abbas must have felt the complex emotions of a man returning home after what he perhaps sensed would be his final campaign. The city that he had transformed from a provincial centre into the jewel of his empire spread before him like a living monument to his vision and determination. The domes and minarets, the palaces and gardens, the bustling bazaars and workshops, all bore the stamp of his creative will and reflected the prosperity that his policies had fostered. The final years of Abbas's reign unfolded in the hushed atmosphere of a court that sensed the approaching end of an era. The Shah, now in his 70s, moved through his daily routines with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that each action might be among his last. The morning audiences, the afternoon councils, the evening prayers, all continued according to the patterns established over decades of rule. Yet everyone present was aware that these familiar rituals were gradually taking on the character of a farewell. The question of succession, which had hovered over the court like a shadow for years, now became the central preoccupation of everyone who held a stake in the empire's future. Prince Tahmasp, the designated heir, had grown into a capable young man under his father's careful guidance, but he lacked the charismatic presence and battle-tested authority that had made Abbas such a commanding figure. The transition from the rule of a lion to the leadership of a more conventional monarch would test every institution that Abbas had created. Abbas spent increasing amounts of time in private consultation with his son, sharing the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent in the exercise of absolute power. These conversations, conducted in the intimate setting of the royal quarters, covered every aspect of governance from the grand strategies of international diplomacy to the minute details of provincial administration. The aging Shah was attempting to compress decades of experience into the brief time that remained, knowing that his heir would need every advantage to navigate the challenges that lay ahead. The administrative systems that Abbas had perfected continued to function with smooth efficiency, but subtle changes in the empire's governance began to reflect the reality of his declining involvement. The Ghulam officials who had learned to implement his will with precise obedience now found themselves forced to exercise greater independent judgment. The provincial governors who had grown accustomed to receiving detailed instructions from Isfahan began to develop their own approaches to local problems. this gradual decentralization of authority was not necessarily unwelcome. The empire had grown too large and complex for any single ruler to micromanage every detail, regardless of his capabilities. The system of trained administrators and loyal officials that Abbas had created was proving its worth by maintaining stability and continuity, even as the central authority that had shaped it began to weaken. The economic prosperity that had characterized Abbas's reign continued to generate the wealth that sustained his great projects and military forces. The silk trade, carefully nurtured through decades of investment and diplomatic effort, provided a steady stream of revenue that flowed into the royal treasury. The artisan workshops of Isfahan, protected by guild regulations and royal patronage, continued to produce the luxury goods that commanded premium prices in markets from Venice to Beijing. Yet economic success brought its own challenges. The wealth of the empire had attracted the attention of European powers, who saw in Persia both an opportunity for profit and a potential threat to their own interests. The Dutch, English, and French merchants who had established trading posts along the Persian Gulf coast were no longer content to serve merely as intermediaries in the silk trade. They began to push for greater political influence, seeking to involve themselves in the internal affairs of the provinces where their commercial interests were strongest. Abbas's response to these pressures reflected the sophisticated understanding of international relations that he had developed over decades of dealing with European powers. He recognized that Persia's economic prosperity depended on maintaining access to European markets, but he was equally determined to prevent foreign merchants from gaining the kind of political influence that had proved so destructive in other parts of the Muslim world. The delicate balance that he maintained between commercial openness and political independence would prove to be one of his most important legacies. Future generations of Persian rulers would face the same fundamental challenge of how to benefit from contact with the wider world while maintaining the integrity of their own cultural and political institutions. The religious landscape of the empire during these final years reflected the complex legacy of Abbas's policies toward religious minorities. The Armenian community in New Ulfa had become so successful that their churches and schools rivaled those of the Muslim population in their architectural grandeur and cultural sophistication. The Jewish merchants who had found refuge in Persian territories had established themselves as important links in the international trading networks that connected the empire to distant markets. Orthodox Shia clerics continued to express concerns about the prominence of religious minorities in the empire's commercial life, but their complaints were increasingly tempered by recognition of the practical benefits that religious diversity had brought to the realm. The tax revenues generated by non-Muslim communities helped fund the mosques and religious schools that served the broader population. The skilled artisans and merchants from minority communities had contributed to the prosperity that enabled the empire to maintain its military strength and cultural achievements. Abbas's own religious practice during these final years reflected the deep personal piety that had always coexisted with his pragmatic approach to governance. He spent longer hours in prayer and meditation, seeking in spiritual contemplation the peace that had often eluded him during the tumultuous years of conquest and consolidation. The private mosque within the royal palace became a refuge where he could commune with the divine away from the pressures of earthly rulership. The gardens of Isfahan, always a source of personal pleasure for the Shah, took on an even greater significance during these twilight years. He would spend entire afternoons in these carefully cultivated spaces, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by poets and musicians who understood that their role was to enhance rather than disturb the contemplative atmosphere. The sound of water flowing through channels, the scent of roses and jasmine, the play of light and shadow through carefully arranged foliage, all combined to create an environment that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. In these garden retreats, Abbas found a metaphor for the empire he'd created. Like the paradise gardens themselves, the Safavid realm represented the triumph of human will and creativity over the raw materials of nature. The careful balance of different elements, the harmony achieved through skilled planning and patient cultivation, the beauty that emerged from the disciplined application of knowledge and resources, all reflected the same principles that had guided his approach to governance. The winter of 1628 arrived in Isfahan with an unusual severity that seemed to match the declining vitality of the empire's greatest ruler. Snow fell more heavily than anyone could remember, transforming the city's familiar landmarks into a landscape of white silence that muffled the normal sounds of urban life. Within the royal palace, Abbas moved through chambers that had grown cold despite the best efforts of braziers and fireplaces, his breath visible in the morning air as he performed the daily rituals that had structured his existence for so many years. The Shah's physicians, men trained in the medical traditions that had been refined over centuries of Islamic scholarship, recognized that their patient was entering the final phase of his earthly journey. The remedies that had sustained him through earlier health crises no longer provided the same relief. The body that had endured countless campaigns, survived assassination attempts, and weathered the accumulated stresses of absolute power was finally approaching the limits of its endurance. Yet Abbas's mind remained remarkably clear, perhaps sharpened by the awareness that his time was growing short. He spent long hours in consultation with his son Tamas, sharing insights and observations that could only be gained through a lifetime of experience at the summit of power. These conversations, conducted in the quiet intimacy of the royal quarters, covered every aspect of governance from the grand strategies of international diplomacy to the intimate details of court protocol. The aging Shah was particularly concerned about the challenges that would face his successor in maintaining the delicate balance of forces that had kept the empire stable and prosperous. The tribal leaders who had been brought under central control through a combination of rewards and threats would need to be managed with continued skill and vigilance. The provincial governors who had learned to function within the framework of centralized authority would require careful supervision to prevent the emergence of semi-independent power centers. The military machine that Abbas had perfected over decades of reform and innovation represented perhaps his greatest institutional legacy. The Ghulam regiments, trained and equipped according to the latest European methods, provided the empire with a professional armed force that could match any regional opponent. The artillery corps, developed with the assistance of European specialists, gave Persian armies a technological advantage that would remain relevant for generations to come. But military strength alone would not be sufficient to preserve the empire's achievements. The economic policies that had generated the wealth necessary to support Abbas's great projects would need to be maintained with continued wisdom and flexibility. The silk trade, carefully nurtured through decades of investment and diplomatic effort, remained vulnerable to disruption by political upheavals or changes in international market conditions. The religious policies that had balanced the demands of orthodox Shia clerics with the practical benefits of religious diversity would require equally careful attention. The success of the Armenian community in New Ulfa, the prosperity of Jewish merchants in the empire's commercial centers, the contributions of various Christian communities to the realm's economic and cultural life, all represented achievements that could be easily destroyed by less tolerant successors. As spring approached, Abbas made what those close to him recognized as a final tour of the architectural monuments that had transformed Isfahan into one of the world's great cities. The Imam Mosque, with its soaring dome and intricate tile work, stood as a testament to the Islamic faith that had provided the spiritual foundation for his dynasty. The Ali Kapu Palace, with its music room and gardens, reflected the Persian cultural renaissance that had flourished under his patronage. The bazaars and workshops that surrounded these great monuments buzzed with the commercial activity that had made Isfahan a centre of international trade. The skilled artisans who had been gathered from across the empire and beyond continued their work, creating the luxury goods that commanded premium prices in markets from Venice to Beijing. The merchants who had established their businesses under the protection of royal authority continued to maintain the trading networks that connected Persia to the wider world. But for Abbas, these familiar sights and sounds now carried the poignancy of a farewell. The city that he had transformed from a provincial centre into the jewel of his empire would soon continue its life without the guiding hand that had shaped its development. The streets that had known his presence for so many years would witness the rule of his successors, men who would face the challenge of maintaining what he had built while adapting to the changing circumstances of a new age. The final months of Abbas's reign were marked by an intensification of the spiritual practices that had always provided a counterpoint to his worldly responsibilities. He spent longer hours in prayer and meditation, seeking in contemplation of the divine the peace that had often eluded him during the tumultuous years of conquest and consolidation. The private mosque within the royal palace became a refuge where he could commune with the eternal truths that transcended the temporary concerns of earthly rulership. His personal servants, men who had attended him for decades and who understood his habits and preferences with intimate familiarity, noted the gradual changes in his daily routine. The morning audiences, once conducted with the vigorous energy of a man eager to tackle the day's challenges, now proceeded with the measured pace of someone conserving his strength for the most essential tasks. The afternoon councils, where the business of the empire was conducted, required longer periods of rest and reflection. Yet even in decline, Abbas maintained the royal dignity that had always been central to his conception of kingship. He continued to appear before his courtiers and officials in the full regalia of Persian monarchy, his presence alone sufficient to inspire the loyalty and respect that had sustained his authority for so many years. The ceremony and protocol that surrounded his person remained unchanged, creating an atmosphere of continuity that helped to mask the reality of his approaching departure. The 19th day of January 1629 dawned grey and cold over Isfahan, the winter air carrying a stillness that seemed to penetrate the very stones of the royal palace. Within the private chambers where Abbas had spent the final months of his reign, the great Shah lay surrounded by the familiar objects that had anchored his existence for so many years. The prayer carpets where he had sought divine guidance, the books of poetry that had provided solace in moments of solitude, the weapons that had served him in countless battles, all bore witness to the approaching end of an era. The physicians who had attended him through his final illness recognized that their patient was entering the last phase of his earthly journey. The remedies that had sustained him through earlier crises no longer provided relief, and the body that had endured so much was finally approaching the limits of its endurance. Yet Abbas's mind remained clear, perhaps sharpened by the knowledge that his time was growing short. Prince Tahmasp, summoned to his father's bedside, found the aging Shah propped against silk cushions, his eyes still bright with the intelligence that had guided the empire through its greatest triumphs. The conversation that passed between father and son in those final hours would remain private, but those who waited outside the chamber could sense the weight of the moment. The transfer of power from one of history's greatest rulers to an untested successor was taking place in the intimate setting of a deathbed, away from the ceremonies and protocols that normally accompanied such momentous transitions. The great courtiers and officials who had served Abbas with unwavering loyalty gathered in the palace's outer chambers, their faces reflecting the complex emotions that accompanied the approaching loss of the master who had shaped their lives and careers. These men, drawn from across the empire and beyond, had found in Abbas's service a purpose that transcended their individual ambitions. The Ghulam officers who had learned warfare at his side, the administrative officials who had implemented his policies, the diplomatic representatives who had negotiated on his behalf, all faced the prospect of continuing their work under a new monarch whose capabilities remained untested. As the day wore on, word spread through the palace corridors that the Shah's condition was worsening. The normal bustle of court life gradually gave way to a hushed atmosphere of anticipation and mourning. Servants moved through the halls with muffled steps, their usual conversations replaced by whispered exchanges about the implications of the approaching transition. The ceremonies and audiences that structured daily life in the palace were quietly suspended, creating an unusual stillness that seemed to reflect the gravity of the moment. The religious officials who had served as spiritual advisors to the Shah throughout his reign were summoned to perform the final rituals that would ease his passage from this world to the next. The prayers and verses that had sustained him through the triumphs and trials of his long career now provided comfort in his final hours. The Shia faith that had provided the spiritual foundation for his dynasty offered its believers the promise of divine mercy and eternal peace for those who had served the cause of justice and righteousness. As evening approached, Abbas's breathing became more laboured, and those present recognized that the end was near. The man who'd commanded armies, negotiated with emperors, and transformed the face of Persia was approaching the final destination that awaited all mortals, regardless of their earthly achievements. The crown that had rested so heavily on his brow for 42 years would soon pass to younger hands, carrying with it the accumulated weight of generations of Safavid rule. In the quiet hours before dawn on January 19, 1629, Shah Abbas the Great breathed his last, surrounded by the family members, courtiers and servants who had shared his life and witnessed his achievements. The man who'd been born into a world of chaos and civil war, who had survived the murderous intrigues of his youth, who had transformed a declining dynasty into a great empire, had finally completed his earthly journey. The silence that followed his last breath seemed to echo through the palace corridors, marking the end of an era in Persian history. The immediate aftermath of the Shah's death was handled with the efficiency and discretion that had characterized his administration throughout his reign. The transition protocols that had been carefully planned were implemented smoothly, ensuring that the news of his passing was communicated to key officials and provincial governors in an orderly fashion. Prince Tahmasp, now Shah Tahmasp I, assumed the responsibilities of rulership with the support of the administrative apparatus that his father had created. The funeral arrangements reflected both the Islamic traditions that governed such ceremonies and the particular grandeur that befitted a ruler of Abbas's stature. The body of the great Shah was prepared according to religious custom, wrapped in the simple shroud that emphasized the equality of all souls before divine judgment. Yet the ceremonies that accompanied his burial were conducted with the pomp and circumstance that acknowledged his unique place in Persian history. The people of Isfahan, who had witnessed the transformation of their city under Abbas's rule, gathered in the streets to pay their respects as the funeral procession made its way to the royal mausoleum. The artisans whose workshops had flourished under his patronage, the merchants whose businesses had prospered through his policies, the common citizens who had benefited from the peace and prosperity of his reign, all joined in the collective mourning that marked the passing of their greatest ruler. The international response to news of Abbas's death reflected the respect and attention that he had commanded throughout the known world. European courts, which had maintained diplomatic relations with Persia for decades, recognized that one of the age's most formidable rulers had passed from the scene. The Ottoman Empire, which had struggled against Persian power throughout Abbas's reign, acknowledged the loss of a worthy adversary whose military and diplomatic skills had commanded their grudging respect. The Mughal court in Delhi, which had maintained complex relations with Persia throughout Abbas's reign, understood that the death of the great Shah marked a significant shift in the balance of power across the Islamic world. The rulers of the various Central Asian kingdoms, who had learned to respect Persian strength and influence, began to reassess their own positions in light of the changed circumstances that would emerge under new leadership. In the months following Abbas's death, the true measure of his achievement became apparent through the stability and continuity that characterized the transition to his successor. The administrative systems that he had perfected continued to function with smooth efficiency, implementing the policies and maintaining the institutions that had made the Safavid Empire one of the great powers of its age. The provincial governors who had learned to operate within the framework of centralized authority maintained their loyalty to the crown, ensuring that the empire's vast territories remained under effective control. The military machine that Abbas had created proved its worth in the early years of his successor's reign, deterring potential threats and maintaining the security that had become synonymous with Safavid rule. The Ghulam regiments, trained and equipped according to the latest European methods, continued to provide the empire with a professional armed force that commanded respect throughout the region. The artillery corps, developed with the assistance of European specialists, maintained the technological advantages that had proved so decisive in earlier conflicts. The economic prosperity that had characterized Abbas's reign continued to generate the wealth necessary to support the empire's great projects and military forces. The silk trade, carefully nurtured through decades of investment and diplomatic effort, remained a crucial source of revenue that flowed into the royal treasury. The artisan workshops of Isfahan, protected by guild regulations and royal patronage, continued to produce the luxury goods that commanded premium prices in international markets. Yet the absence of Abbas's personal leadership gradually began to reveal the extent to which the empire's success had depended on his unique combination of vision, energy, and political skill. The challenges that had been managed through his direct intervention now required solutions from officials who lacked his experience and authority. The delicate balance of forces that had kept the empire stable and prosperous needed to be maintained by successors who had not participated in its creation. The religious policies that had balanced the demands of Orthodox Shia clerics with the practical benefits of religious diversity faced new pressures as different voices competed for influence in the post-Abbas court. The success of the Armenian community in New Hulfa, the prosperity of Jewish merchants in the empire's commercial centres, the contributions of various Christian communities to the realm's economic and cultural life, all represented achievements that required continued protection and support. The architectural monuments that had transformed Isfahan into one of the world's great cities stood as permanent testaments to Abbas's vision and achievement. The Imam Mosque, with its soaring dome and intricate tilework, continued to inspire wonder and reverence among visitors from across the Islamic world. The Ali Kapu Palace, with its music room and gardens, remained a symbol of the Persian cultural renaissance that had flourished under his patronage. The bazaars and workshops that surrounded these great monuments continued to buzz with the commercial activity that had made Isfahan a centre of international trade. The skilled artisans who had been gathered from across the empire and beyond maintained their traditions, passing on to new generations the techniques and knowledge that had made Persian craftsmanship renowned throughout the known world. The merchants who had established their businesses under the protection of royal authority continued to maintain the trading networks that connected Persia to distant markets. But the city that Abbas had transformed from a provincial centre into the jewel of his empire began to change in subtle ways that reflected the altered circumstances of the post-Abbas era. The creative energy that had driven the great building projects of his reign was channeled into maintaining existing structures rather than creating new ones. The patronage that had supported poets, artists and scholars continued, but with less of the personal involvement that had characterized the great Shah's approach to cultural affairs. The international reputation that Abbas had built for the Safavid Empire continued to command respect, but the active diplomacy that had been so characteristic of his reign gradually gave way to a more passive approach to foreign relations. The European powers that had maintained embassies in Isfahan continued their commercial activities, but the strategic partnerships that Abbas had cultivated began to evolve in response to changing circumstances and new leadership priorities. The Ottoman Empire, which had struggled against Persian power throughout Abbas's reign, began to reassess its position on the contested frontiers between the two powers. The victories that Abbas had achieved through his military reforms and strategic innovations had shifted the balance of power in Persia's favour, but maintaining that advantage would require continued vigilance and resources. The border regions that had been secured through decades of conflict remained vulnerable to renewed Ottoman pressure. The legacy of Abbas's reign was perhaps most clearly visible in the transformation of Persian society itself. The empire that he had inherited from his predecessors had been marked by tribal divisions, religious discord, and economic stagnation. The realm that he bequeathed to his successors was characterized by centralized authority, religious tolerance, and commercial prosperity. The change represented more than a political achievement. It reflected a fundamental shift in the character and capabilities of Persian civilization. The educational institutions that had been established under Abbas's patronage continued to train the scholars, administrators, and clerics who would serve the empire in future generations. The schools and libraries that had been founded with royal support maintained the intellectual traditions that had made Persian culture a beacon of learning and refinement. The manuscripts and books that had been collected and preserved under his patronage would continue to influence Persian thought and culture for centuries to come. The legal and administrative systems that Abbas had developed provided the framework for governance that would endure long after his death. The codes and procedures that had been refined through decades of practical experience offered solutions to the problems that inevitably arose in the administration of a vast and diverse empire. The precedents that had been established during his reign would guide future generations of Persian rulers in their efforts to maintain justice and order. The religious architecture that had been constructed under Abbas patronage continued to serve the spiritual needs of the empire's population, while demonstrating the majesty and devotion of the Safavid dynasty. The mosques and shrines that had been built or renovated during his reign provided centers of worship and community life that strengthened the bonds between the rulers and the ruled. The religious endowments that had been established with royal support continued to fund schools, hospitals, and charitable institutions that served the broader population. The cultural achievements of Abbas's reign created a standard of excellence that would inspire future generations of Persian artists, poets, and craftsmen. The synthesis of influences from across the Islamic world and beyond had produced a distinctive Persian style that would be recognized and admired throughout the region. The patronage that had supported cultural activities during his reign had established traditions and institutions that would continue to nurture artistic and intellectual achievement. As the years passed and the immediate circumstances of Abbas's death receded into history, the true dimensions of his achievement became clearer. The empire that he had created represented more than a political or military success. It embodied a vision of what Persian civilization could achieve when its resources were properly organized and directed. The balance of tradition and innovation, of religious devotion and practical tolerance, of centralized authority and local diversity, all reflected the wisdom and skill of a ruler who'd understood both the possibilities and the limitations of his age. In the decades that followed Abbas's death, the Safavid Empire continued to bear the imprint of his transformative reign, even as new challenges and changing circumstances began to reshape the political landscape of the Persian world. The administrative systems that he had created proved remarkably durable, providing the framework for governance that would endure through the reigns of his successors. The military innovations that he'd introduced remained effective, though the strategic situation that had given them their greatest advantages gradually evolved in response to changing regional dynamics. The economic prosperity that had characterized his reign continued to generate the wealth necessary to support the empire's great projects and military forces. Though the international trading networks that he had so carefully cultivated began to shift in response to new opportunities and changing political circumstances, the European powers that had maintained commercial relations with Persia throughout his reign continued their activities, but the strategic partnerships that Abbas had cultivated began to evolve as European interests expanded into new regions and markets. The religious policies that had balanced the demands of Orthodox Shia clerics with the practical benefits of religious diversity faced new pressures as different voices competed for influence in the post-Abbas court. The success of the Armenian community in New Julfa, the prosperity of Jewish merchants in the empire's commercial centers, the contributions of various Christian communities to the realm's economic and cultural life, all represented achievements that required continued protection and support from rulers who might not share Abbas's sophisticated understanding of religious politics. The architectural monuments that had transformed Isfahan into one of the world's great cities continued to inspire wonder and admiration among visitors from across the Islamic world and beyond. The Imam Mosque, with its soaring dome and intricate tilework, remained a testament to the Islamic faith that had provided the spiritual foundation for the Safavid dynasty. The Ali Kapu Palace, with its music room and gardens, continued to serve as a symbol of the Persian cultural renaissance that had flourished under Abbas's patronage. But the city that Abbas had transformed from a provincial centre into the jewel of his empire began to change in subtle ways that reflected the altered circumstances of the post-Abbas era. The creative energy that had driven the great building projects of his reign was gradually channeled into maintaining existing structures rather than creating new ones. The patronage that had supported poets, artists, and scholars continued, but with less of the personal involvement and visionary leadership that had characterized the great Shah's approach to cultural affairs. The international reputation that Abbas had built for the Safavid Empire continued to command respect throughout the region and beyond, but the active diplomacy that had been so characteristic of his reign gradually gave way to a more passive approach to foreign relations. The European embassies that had maintained their presence in Isfahan continued their commercial activities, but the strategic partnerships that Abbas had cultivated began to evolve in response to changing circumstances and new leadership priorities. The Ottoman Empire, which had struggled against Persian power throughout Abbas's reign, began to reassess its position on the contested frontiers between the two powers. The victories that Abbas had achieved through his military reforms and strategic innovations had shifted the balance of power in Persia's favour, but maintaining that advantage would require continued vigilance, resources, and skilled leadership. The border regions that had been secured through decades of conflict remained vulnerable to renewed Ottoman pressure if Persian strength should weaken. The tribal leaders who had been brought under central control through Abbas's combination of rewards and threats continued to operate within the framework of royal authority, but their loyalty to the crown depended on the continued ability of the central government to provide the benefits and protection that had made submission preferable to independence. The complex balance of forces that had kept the empire stable and prosperous needed to be maintained by successors who had not participated in its creation and who might not fully understand its delicate mechanisms. The legacy of Abbas's reign was perhaps most clearly visible in the transformation of Persian society itself. The empire that he had inherited from his predecessors had been marked by tribal divisions, religious discord, economic stagnation, and political instability. The realm that he bequeathed to his successors was characterized by centralized authority, religious tolerance, commercial prosperity, and cultural achievement. The change represented more than a political accomplishment. It reflected a fundamental shift in the character and capabilities of Persian civilization. The educational institutions that had been established under Abbas's patronage continued to train the scholars, administrators, and clerics who would serve the empire in future generations. The schools and libraries that had been founded with royal support maintained the intellectual traditions that had made Persian culture a beacon of learning and refinement throughout the Islamic world. The manuscripts and books that had been collected and preserved under his patronage would continue to influence Persian thought and culture for centuries to come. The legal and administrative systems that Abbas had developed provided the framework for governance that would endure long after his death. The codes and procedures that had been refined through decades of practical experience offered solutions to the problems that inevitably arose in the administration of a vast and diverse empire. The precedents that had been established during his reign would guide future generations of Persian rulers in their efforts to maintain justice and order in their territories. The religious architecture that had been constructed under Abbas's patronage continued to serve the spiritual needs of the empire's population while demonstrating the majesty and devotion of the Safavid dynasty. The mosques and shrines that had been built or renovated during his reign provided centers of worship and community life that strengthened the bonds between the rulers and the ruled. The religious endowments that had been established with royal support continued to fund schools, hospitals, and charitable institutions that served the broader population. The cultural achievements of Abbas's reign created a standard of excellence that would inspire future generations of Persian artists, poets, and craftsmen. The synthesis of influences from across the Islamic world and beyond had produced a distinctive Persian style that would be recognized and admired throughout the region. The patronage that had supported cultural activities during his reign had established traditions and institutions that would continue to nurture artistic and intellectual achievement long after his death. As the years passed, and the immediate circumstances of Abbas's death receded into history, the true dimensions of his achievement became clearer to those who studied the transformation of Persian civilization during his reign. The empire that he had created represented more than a political or military success. It embodied a vision of what Persian civilization could achieve when its resources were properly organized and directed by skilled and visionary leadership. The balance of tradition and innovation, of religious devotion and practical tolerance, of centralized authority and local diversity that had characterized his reign reflected the wisdom and skill of a ruler who had understood both the possibilities and the limitations of his age. The synthesis of Persian, Islamic, and international influences that had marked his approach to governance, culture, and diplomacy would continue to influence the development of Persian civilization for generations to come. The memory of Abbas's reign would endure not only in the official histories that recorded his achievements, but in the collective consciousness of the Persian people, who would remember him as the ruler who had restored their nation to greatness and given them a place of honor among the great powers of the world. The stories that would be told about his life and accomplishments would inspire future generations of Persian leaders and thinkers, providing them with examples of what could be achieved through vision, determination, and skilled leadership. In the gardens of Isfahan, where the fountains still murmur their eternal songs and the cypress trees stand like silent sentinels against the sky, the spirit of Abbas the Great lingers in the spaces between memory and time. The palace corridors that once echoed with the footsteps of the master of Persia now carry only the whispered conversations of guides who tell his story to visitors from distant lands. The throne room where he held court with emperors and ambassadors has become a museum of faded grandeur, its carpets worn thin by the passage of centuries, its walls bearing witness to glories that have passed into legend. The city that he transformed from a provincial centre into the jewel of his empire continues its life, according to rhythms that he set in motion nearly 4 centuries ago. The bazaars still hum with commercial activity, though the silk merchants who once traded with Venice and Amsterdam have given way to vendors of carpets and handicrafts who serve the modern tourist trade. The artisan workshops that produced the luxury goods that commanded premium prices in international markets still exist, though their output now serves different purposes and reaches different audiences. The mosque that bears his name stands as a testament to the Islamic faith that provided the spiritual foundation for his dynasty, its dome still catching the light of dawn and dusk as it has for centuries. The prayers that rise from its mihrab continue to echo the devotions that sustained him through the triumphs and trials of his long reign. The faithful who gather beneath its soaring arches may not remember the specific details of his achievements, but they inhabit a world that his vision helped create. The empire that he built with such skill and determination has long since passed into history, its borders redrawn by the conflict and negotiations of succeeding ages. The administrative systems that he perfected have been replaced by new forms of governance that reflect the changing needs and expectations of modern times. The military innovations that gave his armies their decisive advantages have been superseded by technologies that he could never have imagined. Yet something of his legacy persists in the cultural memory of the Persian people, who continue to take pride in the achievements of their golden age and to draw inspiration from the example of a ruler who understood that true greatness lies not in conquest alone, but in the creation of lasting institutions and the nurturing of human potential. The stories that are told about his life and accomplishments have become part of the fabric of Persian identity, providing a link between the glorious past and the uncertain future. The diplomatic innovations that he pioneered in his relations with European powers established patterns of international engagement that would influence Persian foreign policy for generations to come. The religious policies that balanced the demands of Orthodox faith with the practical benefits of tolerance created precedents that would be remembered whenever Persian rulers faced similar challenges. The economic strategies that generated the wealth necessary to support his great projects demonstrated the importance of trade and commerce in the foundation of political power. In the great libraries of the world, scholars continue to study the documents and chronicles that record his achievements, seeking to understand the principles and methods that enabled him to transform a declining dynasty into a great empire. The letters that he exchanged with European monarchs, the reports that his ambassadors sent from foreign courts, the administrative records that document the daily operations of his government, all provide glimpses into the mind of a ruler who combined visionary thinking with practical skill. The architectural monuments that he created continue to inspire architects and artists who seek to understand the principles of beauty and proportion that guided Persian builders in their golden age. The gardens that he designed still demonstrate the Persian understanding of paradise as a place where water, vegetation, and built structures combine to create environments that nourish both body and spirit. The decorative arts that flourished under his patronage continue to influence craftsmen who work in the traditional Persian styles. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of his legacy lies in the example that he provided of what can be achieved when vision, determination, and skilled leadership are combined with deep understanding of human nature and the dynamics of power. The challenges that he faced, tribal divisions, religious discord, economic stagnation, foreign threats, were not unique to his time and place. His responses to these challenges offer lessons that remain relevant to leaders who must navigate the complexities of governing diverse populations in an interconnected world. The balance that he achieved between tradition and innovation, between religious devotion and practical tolerance, between centralized authority and local diversity, reflects a sophisticated understanding of the art of governance that transcends the specific circumstances of early modern Persia. His ability to synthesize influences from across the Islamic world and beyond, while maintaining the distinctive character of Persian civilization, demonstrates the possibility of cultural exchange without cultural submission. As the sun sets over the minarets of Isfahan, casting long shadows across the courtyards where he once walked in contemplation, the memory of Abbas the Great becomes part of the eternal conversation between past and present, between the achievements of those who came before and the aspirations of those who will come after. The silence that surrounds his tomb speaks not of ending but of transformation, not of loss but of continuity, not of death but of the immortality that belongs to those whose works outlast the brief span of mortal existence. In the end, the story of Shah Abbas the Great is not simply the biography of a Persian ruler, but a meditation on the nature of greatness itself. It reminds us that true achievement lies not in the accumulation of power for its own sake, but in the creation of institutions and cultural expressions that serve human flourishing. It demonstrates that the greatest monuments are not built of stone and mortar, but of the transformed lives and elevated aspirations of the people who benefit from wise and compassionate leadership. The winds that blow across the Iranian plateau, carry with them the dust of empires and the memories of kings, but they also carry the dreams of those who continue to seek justice, beauty, and meaning in their lives. In that eternal dialogue between human aspiration and divine possibility, this spirit of Abbas the Great finds its truest and most lasting monument, not in the crumbling walls of ancient palaces, but in the continuing human quest for a world that reflects the best of what we might become. And so the story ends where it began, in the realm of memory and imagination, where the great deeds of the past continue to inspire those who would build something worthy of their own brief time upon the earth. This silence of kings is not the silence of death, but the silence of seeds waiting for the proper season to bloom again, in forms that their planters could never have foreseen, but would surely recognize as the fulfillment of their deepest hopes. If this journey through the life of Shah Abbas the Great has moved you to reflect on the nature of leadership, legacy, and the human quest for meaning, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let these timeless stories continue to find new hearts and minds, just as the great Shah's vision continues to inspire those who seek to build something lasting from the materials of their own time and place. Until we meet again in the realm of history's greatest stories, may you find in these ancient echoes the wisdom to navigate the challenges of your own era with grace, courage, and hope.